Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and for once we are on time. So, yes, indeed, it is likely the end of the world. The right, conservatives in the United States, are very important because they really do keep a balance in power on the left, and they're actually decent at implementing ideas when perhaps overly creative people have far too many of them. But having said that, no democracy can function without the left. The left is that force which forces justice, which helps create new policies and new values so that a society doesn't become stagnant and can adapt to changes and become fairer and more egalitarian. Without the left, that will never happen. And you cannot have a stable democracy or a stable society of any kind. Global warming is an issue. How much? Okay, people debate it. But the answer isn't going to be solar power or any of these other fancy new things that we've been thinking about. We probably don't even have the answer yet. The answer is egalitarianism. Believe it or not. It's making it so that more people, men, women, minorities, can all contribute to the problem to increase the brain power we have. I had said this on our last show. Einstein didn't invent anything. He discovered something nobody else had discovered before. And that means other human beings can do it and have probably tried to do it before. So what happens if and when a young black girl in a poor country or hundreds of years ago born a slave was smarter than Einstein? Think it hasn't happened? I guarantee you it has. If we had been egalitarian from the beginning 100,000 years ago, the society wouldn't be twice as good. Would be more than that because it's an algorithmic increase. Once things start going well, things go better and better and better. So egalitarian is in the best interest of every human being, and is the best way to solve crises like global warming and anything else that we encounter. And of course, there are differences between men and women, and certainly, obviously biological differences and temperamental differences even. But the differences are reasonably small. There is far more, and the science is in on this. This is not negotiable. This is not negotiable. There is more in common between men and women across all things than there is a disjunction. We are more alike than unlike. Always have been, always will be. We are human beings first, and our gender or sex different. These are the views of Jordan Peterson. He has expressed them many, many times in many forums and publicly. But many people I've spoken with have not heard these views and didn't realize they were his views. The reason is because of all of a number of complaints about him, how many are justified and how many are not. I think we're going to start to look into. He has a lot of complex ideas, and they are nuanced. And as a member of the left who considers himself fond of nuance, I would consider myself very interested in hearing it. But it's difficult because, well, it's difficult to know what he's saying, and we'll discuss the how and the whys of that. But those are, in fact, his views, and as someone who has spent more than 200 hours now in preparation for this show, going over just about everything I could find he's ever said, I'm very confident in that. So if that's not your impression of him, doesn't mean you're wrong. Maybe he's homophobic and sexist and all this. I'm sure we'll get into that. But he's not easily understood, I think, and I think he's been misrepresented more than once. So tonight, instead of talking about his views in any significant way, they'll come up, believe me. But that's not what we're going to be here to debate. What we're going to be here to debate, first and foremost, is a topic that I've often found interesting and found very important to discuss, which is when should we and shouldn't we listen to the ideas of other people and why, and just how much attention should we pay. I will say this about Jordan Peterson. You should be listening to him. That you need to listen to him. Why? It's really quite simple. Either he's completely off his rocker and is an extraordinarily dangerous member of the alt-right, in which case you have to listen to him because you have to know what he's saying to be able to refute it, and because a lot of other people are listening to him and they need to be made aware. He's not someone to be ignored anymore, hasn't been for a while. And I know many people who still haven't heard of him. If you like his ideas, well, you should listen because he's saying some pretty scary things, actually, most of the time. And I don't think he's saying what many people think he is. So tonight, we are not going to talk about, well, like I said, we're going to spend some time on his positions, I have no doubt. But tonight, we are not going to be focusing primarily on those positions. We are going to be focusing on the difficulties, both because of our own biases, because of the nature of how he talks, and a propensity that certainly makes him look incoherent more than once, and that is one of the major objections to him, talking out of both ends of his mouth. We're going to take a look at some of the things he's said, some of the things that the media has portrayed it to be, and how these dovetail together as we try to understand who is Jordan Peterson. We're going to start with some clips of some of the arguments he's made, some clips of the responses to these arguments, and then we're going to go into the way most people are introduced to him through one of the most staggering interviews I've ever seen, the Cathy Newman interviews. The bio of Cathy Newman and Jordan Peterson are both below, so are definitions of some of the terms we will be using and links to the original sources of all of the clips that we play here. Thank you.
One of our guests of the day is a man you may recognise, or maybe you don't. Jordan Peterson has achieved that rare feat, becoming a global superstar academic. So how did he become so well known? He first came to national prominence in Canada in 2016 in a debate about new laws on gender identity. Bill C-16 made it an offence to refuse to call someone by their chosen gender pronoun. From there, his YouTube star took off, and he has now over 1 million subscribers. And his videos, where he talks everything from identity politics, which we've touched on, to the Bible, to Disney movies, have been viewed over 150 million times. Gosh, that's about the same number of viewers we have on this programme. Last year, he supported ex-Google employee James Damore, who had been fired for suggesting men and women have different interests due to biological differences.
What exactly are all those people who aren't thinking the same way as me saying? You said that there's a bunch of them and a bunch of groups, but you never said what they're saying precisely.
Well, I think our chair would rule me out of order if I proceed.
No, you're fine.
To read out what they're all saying. But in general, they say they oppose discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression. And then there's 3 pages, which I can share with you.
I oppose discrimination against gender identity and gender expression. That's not the point. The point is the specifics of the legislation that surrounds it and the insistence that people will have to use compelled speech. That's what I'm objecting to. There's 500 hours of my teaching to my classrooms on tape on YouTube, and nobody's found a smoking pistol. I'm not a discriminatory individual, but I think this legislation is reprehensible, and I do not believe for a moment that it will do what it intends to do.
You stated before to the BBC that by adhering to people's preferred pronouns, that it's the starting point to an authoritarian regime or society. Is it possible, however, that it's more about giving people more rights and liberty, or even something as fundamental as respect?
Jordan.
No, I never said that. What I said was that I wasn't going to allow the contents of my speech to be dictated by a virtue-signaling government, when never in the history of an English common law society had a government dared to regulate the actual voluntary contents of someone's speech. Or the provincial and federal governments in Canada mandated the use of personal pronouns and made it a criminal offence not to use them. It was not constitutional for the government to place mandatory requirements on what people were required to utter in terms of their voluntary speech. There are certain things you can't say, but the government's not to mandate what you have to say. If I'm dealing with someone reasonable, I address them in the manner that seems to be most appropriate to the social situation and most conducive to their well-being. But as soon as the government decides that they have the right to decide what I have to say because of some false altruism on their part or some underlying and unexpressed ideology, then the answer to that is no damn way.
Do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun?
No, that's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and
no,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
it. No, but that's exactly it. There's
but the motivation behind
There's no motivation behind it. The trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected
they're noisy.
You either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself.
Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but
you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what? Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question.
It's
That's right.
true.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. By the end of 1960s, thereabouts, when even Jean-Paul Sartre finally figured out that to be a communist probably wasn't acceptable, given that the bloody Soviets had killed like 30 million people between 1919 and 1959, and the Maoists had done the same thing on a greater scale in China. They say, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, okay, well, how many countries do you need to disprove your thesis? How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong? So Solzhenitsyn took that argument apart, partly in his book Lenin in Zurich, and then partly in the Gulag Archipelago. But groundwork had already been laid for all that by Nietzsche, who knew exactly what was coming in the 20th century, and by Dostoevsky, who wrote a book called The Possessed back in like 1880, where he outlined in painful detail the precise mindset that would produce the Russian Revolution like 30 years later. Amazing. And Tolstoy as well, he knew what was coming. This blew his worldview apart so badly that he was suicidal at the height of his fame. Tolstoy knew what was going to come too. And so it's not like Solzhenitsyn was the only person who could see this. Orwell knew it. Malcolm Muggeridge knew it in the 1930s when he was noting that the Soviets, given their idea of class guilt, they used that doctrine to just round up all the kulaks. They were the productive farmers and ship them off to Siberia. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. But, you know, they had too many Ukrainians anyway, so it didn't really matter. And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero. You know, you always hear about the 1%, right? The evil 1%. And they churn, by the way, because it's not the same people all the time. You know, you need to make $30,000 a year to be in the top 1% of the socioeconomic distribution worldwide. It's like, all of you here are in the evil 1%, And you think, well, that's not very fair because I was really only talking about within my country. Well, that's convenient for you.
You've talked a lot in defense of traditional hierarchies, both of gender, of class, so on, though emphatically not of race. And so it seems that...
I haven't talked about defense of traditional hierarchies in terms of gender and class. That's not true.
Well, you've talked about hierarchies in society. You've talked about...
Yeah, that's true. I have done that. But I haven't justified them on the basis of gender and class. Whatever it was, two categories.
You talk
not
about,
okay. That's an important distinction.
Okay, but you defend hierarchies in society in a way that... You talk a lot about the Pareto distribution, yes?
That doesn't mean I defend it.
Well, okay.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you talk
Observing that something exists is not the same as defending it. How in the world...
Well, people attack it.
I said that they were inevitable.
Yes, that they were inevitable. Some people
that
disagree
doesn't
with
mean that they're good.
Anyone who has a counter view to the socialists, PC, lobby, Greens, Communist Brigade...
Your friend.
Are shouted
on national television right now.
Shouted down,
literally,
and called racists or homophobics.
Well, your claim that if we engage in certain types of discussions, this kind of reaction emerges is absolutely the case. I mean, for at least 6 months after I made what you might describe as my initial political stance, I was swarmed by people who were using every possible pejorative to take me out so that none of my arguments needed to be taken seriously. We have this idea, promulgated primarily by the ignorant left, I would say, that you can place the responsibility for hierarchy and inequality at the feet of Western civilization and capitalism. Okay, that's wrong. It's not just a little bit wrong, it's unbelievably wrong, and it's actually wrong in a way that's counterproductive to the aims of the left. Because there are terrible things about hierarchy and inequality. I mean, the problem with hierarchy is that it produces inequality, and the problem with inequality is that people tend to stack up at zero, right? You get people who fall out of society, they stack up at zero, and they can't get away from the bottom. And then they get angry and they get hostile and the whole society becomes destabilized. Plus, there's all the suffering that goes along with that kind of unequal distribution of resources. And the left points to that and says, well, this isn't good, we should do something about it. Then they take the next step and they say, well, it's a unique side effect of Western civilization and capitalism. It's like, no, it's not. That's not even close to right. It's way worse than that. It's way deeper than that. We're way past that. And so if the left is serious about inequality, they have to rethink they have to be more pessimistic than they are.
Especially given that there's no evidence that moving the language in a compelled manner in this direction is going to have any beneficial effect. We're supposed to assume that just because hypothetically the intent is positive, that the outcome will be positive. And
interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male, and we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. I mean, part of the reason the postmodern types have been going after me is because I've dared to say that men and women differ in temperament, which, by the way, they do. So that's actually something that might be worth just differentiating quickly, because it's actually technically somewhat challenging, but also very much worth knowing. We are more the same than different. If you look at our temperaments, there's more overlap than there is variance by a substantial amount. And so even on the temperamental dimensions where there is most difference between men and women, the difference isn't of massive magnitude at the center of the distribution. So for example, women are less aggressive than men. If you draw a random woman and a random man out of the population, the probability that the man will be more aggressive is 60%. If you bet on the man, you'd win 60% of the time. That's not a walloping difference. It's not 95% of the time. You know, it's a difference that is substantive, it's significant, it's measurable, but it's not large by the standards by which such things are judged. But that's not the point. The point is that most of the activity takes place at the extremes. So out on the tails of the distribution. So here's an example. About 9 out of 10 people in prison are male. Why? Because to be in prison, you have to be the most aggressive person, let's say, in 100. Okay. Those differences at the midpoint are large enough so that if you go out to the extremes, 1 in 100 people, you have an overwhelming preponderance of men. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. You can say, well, yeah, broadly speaking, men and women are more the same than different. The overlap is greater than the disjunction. But that's not relevant if what's being selected is often at the extremes, and it often is. So, for example, with regards to engineering, there's a fair bit of evidence that people who are more interested in things than in people become engineers. Now, that's not really going to be, what is that, shocking? Are you shocked by that? You shouldn't be shocked by that, right? You can tell that not only by what engineers do, but you can tell that by how they think, and you can tell that just by talking to them, if you know a bunch of engineers. So, and it turns out that the largest temperamental difference that's known between men and women is actually interest in people versus interest in things. And so it has nothing to do with competence, but it has a lot to do with interest. And because you have to be very interested in things to go be an engineer, because that's all you're going to be doing if you're an engineer, then only those people who are extremely interested in things tend to become engineers. And most of them are men. And that's why even in places like Scandinavia, where a tremendous amount of effort has been put into flattening the sociocultural landscape, there's still a preponderance of male engineers. And there's a preponderance of female nurses. And no matter how much sociological gerrymandering goes on, those statistics have remained quite intractable over about a 15-year period. Women are higher in the experience of anxiety and emotional pain, and they're more compassionate and agreeable. Those are the big differences. And they're differences of a magnitude that I already pointed out. Then the next question is, well, to what degree is that biological versus sociocultural? You can determine that by stacking up countries from those who have done everything they possibly can to flatten out the sociocultural landscape in relationship to gender, to those who haven't, that are still very stratified. And then what you do is you look at the magnitude of the temperament differences in keeping with the variability that those countries have in terms of their sociocultural egalitarianism. And the sociocultural types, the social constructionists, their prediction is, as cultures become more egalitarian, men and women become more the same, because it's environmental. That isn't what happens. Exactly the opposite happens. As you flatten out the sociocultural landscape, men and women become more different. The data is in. The experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like, all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and welcome to In Time. With me today, as always, is Isandring. Isandring, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good. Glad to hear it. All right. Well, so Jordan Peterson, which it's funny, outside of some circles, especially outside of YouTube and content creators, there's a surprising number of people who haven't heard of him. And it's always amazing. I think everybody must. And so here's the thing. I first heard of Jordan Peterson about, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. And the context I heard him in was always very negative. And there was always just this sort of, and you'd hear this, so that, I'd have a buddy who'd be talking about a content creator that they didn't like, and he said something really stupid, and all of these other objections to the said content creator. And it would always end with the icing on the cake, the cherry on the top was, oh, and he's a fan of Jordan Peterson. And I was tempted more than once to just kind of join in and go, oh, God. But I'm sitting there going, like, I have no idea who the fuck is that guy. And I guess about 2 years ago, it was a GE skeptic and cosmic skeptic were talking about him, and I caught that. And I was like, I don't know anything about him, so of course the natural thing to do is listen to other people talk about him. And one of them said to the others, like, "What do you think of him?" I'm like, well, I think it seems like it's mostly word salad, but then you wonder and you sit there, is he really talking about something? And I think he deliberately kind of courts the far right without completely condemning them, so that he can get, and he's really just trying to shock people. But then again, he says these things, and they really, you can't tell if they're cogent or coherent. And I was just like, holy shit. And these are people who know what coherent means. I mean, it actually has a specific meaning in this context. It's not just an insult. And I was just like, okay. And then one of them said, well, do your impression of him. He goes, sure. And he does this impression. I'm like, holy shit. I was like, that can't be, they're just trolling. That's not the guy. And they're, the other one laughs and goes, that's it. I've never heard such a good impression. How'd you do it? He goes, oh, I just did Kermit the Frog. And I was just like, okay, this can't be right. So it still took a long time for me to really bother. And I did not hear his voice or know or hear any of his views until probably about 3 months ago. So he's something that we've ignored on this show for quite some time. We don't mind getting into controversial topics, and we've said plenty of controversial opinions against the left and the right before. But it was one of those where I decided I really didn't want to do it unless I was going to really dive into it, and we decided that that's what we're going to do. So I've spent easily over 200 hours in the last 2 or 3 months learning his views to the best of my ability. Now, my background, at the dinner table, my father, who was a criminal defense attorney, would force my sister and I to argue different positions and then halfway through switch. So you learned to understand other people's positions and understand them well. And, as Andrew and I have gone at it more than once on some pretty difficult issues. And I hope he'll tell you that, I really am, I could repeat his positions, I think, reasonably well and what he means. And why? And that's actually a skill, and that's not easy to do. And when I got my BA in philosophy, it was extremely useful there. So background in, my father was a lawyer. I certified to teach at least mock trials. So I teach law at the high school level. And, these skills are relevant, and the ability to listen to arguments and the ability to understand when someone is being cogent or just throwing shit past you. And I miss it sometimes, certainly, but anyway, so I did, and I feel actually extremely comfortable now in understanding his positions. I've spoken with people who agree with those positions, and at a minimum, they tend to agree that at least I understand them. And I think you need to understand them. I think they're worth understanding, and understanding genuinely, because he's either the enemy, in which case, and this is the same reason I learned Russia when it was still the Soviet Union, and I learned Russian. So I said, why on earth are you learning Russian? I said, well, one of two things is true. They're either our enemies, in which case learning Russian and knowing it is going to be a really useful fucking skill, and I want to have it. Or there are friends, in which case I'm going to want to know it as well. And I think the same is true as of Jordan Peterson. He's very easy to straw man. And I got to admit, I started listening to it, and I said, okay, he's just throwing shit out there. And I played a clip deliberately of him talking about Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. And so I'm going to put my liberal academic hat on. Yes, I've read all of them, and I know what they're saying. No, I've read. I did the Cliff Notes. Dostoevsky is one of the few that I've read fully through, and that ain't easy. But I read Crime and Punishment through twice. So when he starts talking about Crime and Punishment, I recognize that he's read it. And I know that he's read it because he talks about things you can't find in the Cliff Notes. And he talks about subtleties. And I was just like, okay. And then when he talks about Marxism and all these others, so I was just like, okay, he's got a greater depth of knowledge. And it made it much easier for me to dismiss him. He may be insane in an Elon Musk kind of way, may not. He is brilliant in many ways, graduated a year early from high school in Canada, which isn't easy to do, and is obviously profoundly well educated. So tonight, like I said, I don't want to get too much into his positions. It's going to be absolutely unavoidable. But I do want to get into why it's so hard for people to nail them down. Is he just doing word salad? Is he trying to be evasive? Now, part of this, again, I understand because people accuse me of that all the time, and it's because I hedge and guard everything. They do that in science too, by the way. It was Sam Harris who pointed out that if you want to talk to someone who is least sure in their knowledge when they're talking and guards and hedges everything, talk to a scientist talking about a paper they just published. They'll tell you more about what they can't tell you than what they can. And he's right. So in the interest of discourse and in the interest of trying to at least come to an understanding as to just what it is he's saying, I went through all this and we studied it for more research. And what I found is it's very difficult to find someone who addresses what he's actually saying, and he triggers people very quickly. Now, my first encounter with him was something called the Newman interview. Now, this was an interview given by Cathy Newman. Her credentials are down below. They're pretty impeccable. She is a journalist. She has worked for a number of reputable places, and she's very skilled and very good. However, this interview was astonishing. It was probably, in my mind, one of the most. You'll see it. It was. I still get triggered watching it because it was a difficult interview. It was an extremely difficult interview. We'll see how and why, but I think it highlights one of the problems with trying to have a conversation with or about Jordan Peterson. So having said all that, before we start getting into the interview itself, it's about a 30-minute interview. I suspect it's going to take a while. $2 from Sinister Porpoise. God save the Lobster King. I'm going to... Lobster. The sweet, sweet taste of hierarchy. Thank you, Porpoise, for your support. Appreciate it. Because we're the other thing before, actually, I pass this, I just let Sandra, oh, wow, I have a co-host who can talk. The other thing is, I was talking on the left, and we've been getting into arguments about free speech and letting other people talk and all this other stuff. And I pointed out at one point that when people stop talking, they start shooting. And it's an expression, but it's really very true, and it doesn't take a lot of studying of history. And when I realized that Jordan Peterson had spent an entire year on sabbatical in Europe studying Marxism, Leninism, the things that I had studied in part of learning Russian, and I'd become very fascinated with this. And I realized, okay, now I'm starting to understand with his some of his concern about this stuff, because when you understand also what happened with the Cultural Revolution, that was the left. We know what happens when the right goes unhinged and it gets really fucking bad. Take a look at the KKK, take a look at any number of times that the right has gotten a hold of a fascist state, and you're going to see a lot of suffering, a lot of people die. But it happens with the left too. And he's plenty of people said, well, it wasn't really, socialism or Marxism or whatever. And we again, those arguments we'll save for later. But I can see what his concern is. And he's got some good points as to why that's not a defensive argument. I've heard plenty of people, neoliberals, say, well, we've never really tried capitalism either. So that's up them. It's an easy one to throw out. So we'll get into all of that. But Tony is trolling me already. I'm so glad he's back on the interwebs. Dear Lord. But all of this is because he's not easy to understand, and it's easy to straw man. It's very easy to also misunderstand what he's saying. And the other thing I learned about him, I can't put it on and listen to it in the radio. I can't clean my office while I'm doing. There are plenty of times I'll multitask and listen while I'm doing something. Can't do that with him. I realized I couldn't, and it was going to take a lot of time to sort these things out, because you have to be present and you have to be listening. And I listen like a lawyer, and I listen like a philosopher, and I listen to what he's saying and what he's not saying, and try not to assume he's implying things he's not, because it's real easy to do, and apply a modicum of charity, not maximum. But we'll get into all of that. Is Andrew, any thoughts before we go into the interview?
I think that a lot of people try and put a simplistic view on somebody who's making some pretty complex arguments about incredibly complex issues in the world. There aren't simple answers. And I feel qualified to be on this show, because I am a recognized expert in navigation, both in oceanic navigation and overland navigation and logistics. So I feel I have a good background in being able to try and navigate through some of the arguments and some of the bullshit that pops up. So.
Do any of the mods have the ability to kick people who are in the show, or is it just in the live chat? I'm just asking for a friend. No? Okay. All right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. You are about as educated as just about anyone I've ever met as Andrew. So let's keep that modesty in check. I think you're pretty well read. And you know a lot of shit. But having said that, this was an interview. Now, I've had already the criticisms begin, right? People have said it was a debate and you can treat anybody as hostily as you want to in a debate. It was not a debate. It does say debate because that's in the title, but I've gotten into it with Tangelo, who, well, this study says this, and this. No, the title says that, but even in an APA journal, the title is meaningless. It's the conclusions that you're interested in, and they say the exact opposite. Titles can be clickbaity. This was an interview with News 4 with Cathy Newman. It was an interview. He was invited to just answer some questions and give his views. It turned interesting very quickly. This was not a debate. He was not informed it would be a debate. And while I agree, we'll talk about the role of journalism in a little while. But that's the way it was scheduled. So this was an interview. He was in, I think this was, if I recall, it was the UK. So let's get started with this.
Deceitful and
we're all ready. So let me move that back just 1 second and let's go.
Jordan Peterson, you've said that men need to, quote, grow the hell up. Tell me why.
Well, because there's nothing uglier than an old infant. There's nothing good about it. People who don't grow up don't find the sort of meaning in their life that sustains them through difficult times, and they are certain to encounter difficult times. And they're left bitter and resentful and without purpose and adrift and hostile and resentful and vengeful and arrogant and deceitful and of no use to themselves and of no use to anyone else and no partner for a woman. And there's nothing in it that's good.
So that sounds pretty bad. You're saying there's a crisis of masculinity. I mean, what do you do about it?
You help people understand why it's necessary and important for them to grow up and adopt responsibility. Why that isn't a shake your finger and get your act together sort of thing. Why it's more like a delineation of the kind of destiny that makes life worth living. I've been telling young men, but it's not. I wasn't specifically aiming this message at young men to begin with. It just kind of turned out that way.
And it's mostly, you admit, it's mostly men listening. I mean,
it is.
Your audience is men.
Well, it's about 80% on YouTube, which is a YouTube is a male domain primarily. So it's hard to tell how much of it is because it's male, how much of it is because of what I'm saying.
I may have flipped the switch, so let's just see. Has that dealt with the echo?
What I've been telling young men is that there's an actual reason why they need to grow up. I'll knock it back a second.
Has that dealt with the echo? Hopefully that did. I'm not entirely sure. That's he claimed later that she was actually very nice in the green room, and it was she's a journalist, so this was not ostensibly a debate. It certainly wasn't set up as a debate, and I don't think she claimed later that it was, but that's how it's been framed. But let's let me try to solve that audio problem. I'm rather curious to know now why we're getting that echo. I've worked so hard on the sound. vMix is just a delight. So we should have had at least 10 seconds without the echo. If we didn't, I'll take one more stab at fixing it. If we still had it. All right, then we'll have to. Okay, that was fixed. So good. No, we'll go back. It's only a minute in. I do apologize. If you have it again, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Jordan Peterson, you've said that men need to, quote, grow the hell up. Tell me why.
Well, because there's nothing uglier than an old infant. There's nothing good about it. People who don't grow up don't find the sort of meaning in their life that sustains them through difficult times, and they are certain to encounter difficult times. And they're left bitter and resentful and without purpose and adrift and hostile and resentful and vengeful and arrogant and deceitful and of no use to themselves and of no use to anyone else and no partner for a woman, and there's nothing in it that's good.
So you say, I mean, that sounds pretty bad. You're saying there's a crisis of masculinity. I mean, what do you do about it?
You help people understand why it's necessary and important for them to grow up and adopt responsibility. Why that isn't a shake your finger and get your act together sort of thing. Why it's more like a delineation of the kind of destiny that makes life worth living. I've been telling young men, but it's not, I wasn't specifically aiming this message at young men to begin with. It just kind of turned out that way.
And it's mostly, you admit, it's mostly men listening. I mean,
it
90% of your audiences are male,
well, it's
right?
about 80% on YouTube, YouTube is a male domain primarily. So it's hard to tell how much of it is because YouTube is male and how much of it is because of what I'm saying. But what I've been telling young men is that there's an actual reason why they need to grow up, which is that they have something to offer, that people have within them this capacity to set the world straight, and that's necessary to manifest in the world. And that also doing so is where you find the meaning that sustains you in life.
So what's gone wrong then?
Oh God, all sorts of things have gone wrong. I don't think that young men hear words of encouragement. Some of them never in their entire lives, as far as I can tell. That's what they tell me. And the fact that the words that I've been speaking, the YouTube lectures that I've done and put online, for example, have had such a dramatic impact is an indication that young men are starving for this sort of message, because why in the world would they have to derive it from a lecture on YouTube? They're not being taught that it's important to develop yourself.
But does it bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's no more divisive than the fact that YouTube is primarily male and Tumblr is primarily female.
Isn't it?
Tumblr is primarily female.
But you're just saying that's the way it is.
Well, I'm not saying anything. It's just an observation that that's the way it is. There's plenty of women that are watching my lectures and coming to my talks and buying my books. It's just that the majority of them happen to be men.
What's in it for the women, though?
Well, what sort of partner do you want? Do you want an overgrown child? Or do you want someone to contend with that's going to help you and that
So
you
you're
can
saying
rely on?
women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity?
It depends on what they want. I mean, it's exactly how I laid it out.
Still dealing with a couple of, I'm going to pause it here for just 1 second. So you're saying that women have some sort of duty, and that's not what he said. What he said was, what kind of partner do you want? And, it's like, you don't have a duty to fix anybody. But, I made this, my father first told me that egalitarianism was the best thing ever to happen to men. And he listed a whole bunch of things. He was telling me this as I'm in high school, and I very much agreed with him, and that sort of guided me on a number of things going forward. But so the question is, as a man, would you want a half of a woman partner, a woman who says that she's incomplete unless a man completes her? That strikes me as you're kind of a half an individual if that's what you're looking for in a woman. But we've had a society that's told women that they're worthless unless they're married, unless they have some man to validate them. That's not good for men either. That's not good for any. It's worse for women. So let's not jump down and suggest I'm implying something I'm not. It's worse for women. But Jesus, if you're a man, the best thing you can do is encourage women to be equal. And so what he's saying here is it's sort of the same thing for women. And wouldn't you as a woman want a strong man? And he's going to get into what he means by strong. It's not necessarily like aggressive or bullying. But somebody who can take care of themselves. I think we all kind of want that in a point. Well, no, we don't. Sometimes we don't, and he's going to talk about that too. But this is the first. Okay, so you're saying it is women's responsibility. He didn't say that. He didn't suggest that. He clearly does not believe that. And his answer to that is, well, no, it depends on what you want. But ostensibly, you want a full partner, male, female, doesn't matter. And if you do, which is the healthy thing, and he's a clinical psychologist, by the way, so this is what he does. He's a PhD, he's a clinical psychologist, he's had a lot of patients. So when he says that what's best in everybody's interest is to have complete, full partners, I kind of think he probably knows what he's talking about and is probably right. Is Andrew, any thoughts? You got your audio there?
Yeah, I think one of the other things is, I just don't want to overrun. I'd like us to be able to clearly hear what we're saying. One of the things, she's also kind of implying that, you've got all of these young men following you, as though it's kind of a bad thing. And I'm pulling from some other areas where he's been, pushed on this as well. And they say it as though this is a bad thing. It's like, he clearly states that that's not what he had set out to do, but that, there was a message that resonated with a lot of lost young men. And so quite a few of them end up following him. Not all, about 80% or so are men. But why does that even matter? I don't understand what the relevance of whether he's got 85% men or if it's 85% women. His message is the same to both men and women, that they need to take on the most amount of responsibility that they can handle because it helps them grow up, become responsible, become strong, resilient people, because you're in a world that's dangerous and you're going to come across bad times, and you need to be as resilient as possible. And he's getting into, the relations between men and women, and what do you want in your own relations? Do you want somebody that's an adult, or do you want somebody that's a child? It's not saying that you should do this or should do that, or he's not making any value judgments about it. He's clearly saying, what is it that you want? If you want this, then this. So it just gets, I find it a little disingenuous, and maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it feels that way.
Well, we're 3 minutes in, and he said, men need to grow up. There are too many men in our society who are acting like children. Now, what does grown up mean, and we can equivocate on all of that, and I'm sure people are going to say, well, if he means grown up, okay. I don't think there are many people on the left or the right who would say that that's not necessarily an unfair statement, and he's already being framed as misogynist for that statement, saying that women are responsible to help. It's like he didn't imply that, he didn't suggest that. He said a statement that I think has to be reasonably innocuous and has been echoed by a lot of people and a lot of fucking feminists that I know, excuse me for the, but I mean, I men need to grow up and take some responsibility for a lot of shit, including egalitarianism. He's talked about that before, and making sure that, they're keeping their own house in order, clean your room, as he famously says. I don't see why any of this should be contested, and she's already like, well, so you're saying women need to fix men. It's like, okay, so we're off to the races. That is not what he said, and there is absolutely no way to draw what he said to that, and this is just the beginning.
Rely on.
Women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity.
It depends on what they want. I mean, it's exactly how I laid it out. Like, women deeply want men who are competent and powerful, and I don't mean power in that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Power is competence. And why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a competent partner. So if you want domination...
Want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say women who have had their relationships impaired, their relationships with men impaired, and who are afraid of such relationships will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution.
Do you think that's what a lot of women are doing?
I think there's a substantial minority of women who do that.
The conversation's derailed here, but I'd like to point out what he said too was about dominating. Men have done this too. This isn't unique to women. He's not saying it's unique to women. What he's saying is, if you want, there are people who want to dominate a partner. There are plenty of men who want to do this. We know what that looks like because usually they'll try to do it with. This is not something that he's saying is unique to women. We all do this. It seems to me that we all do it equally. But if you want a partner that you can dominate, he's going to explain why we find that attractive. And I look at some of my past relationships, and I'm going to have to say this because I've never had a relationship that. I've had relationships where I've been attacked physically. I've never had a relationship where I ever struck my partner. That's never happened. It never will happen. But having said that, in terms of dominating, I've had relationships where I've been able to just intellectually overrun my partner, and it's very like, yeah, man. And that's part of growing up, is realizing that that's a really bad fucking idea. But men do it, women do it, we all do it. And what he's saying is that's a bad idea, and I tend to agree with him. But she has now framed it right into women, so now she's asking specifically about women. He's answering specifically about women, which is what she asked, but she's now taking this to, so you're saying this is what women want. Well, on some level, this is what all people want until they grow up. Go back, listen, and that's what he said. That's what he meant, and it's already been taken out of context. Is Andrew, any thoughts on that part, or what?
Just a quick one. To remind people that he is a clinical psychologist and has run a and has been one for over 15 years, actually running a practice, helping other people. So he's in his area of expertise here. He knows what he's talking about.
And he did research. He was a professor and a researcher at Harvard University, and went on again. His CV is down in the So he's actually kind of qualified to talk about this. And to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't said anything that's controversial in any psychology. I've never heard anything he said contested by a psychologist. If you want to contest an individual statement out of context, maybe I still haven't heard that either. I'm sure it's doable. But again, so far, we're 3 minutes in, it's a little contentious, and everything he said strikes me as being reasonable. And I want to say one other thing I meant to say earlier. This is the worst of, in my view, the times when he was strawmanned and not being listened to. I'm not trying to suggest that everyone does this to him all the time. The reason this is the video that most people are introduced to Jordan Peterson by, and they just see, I mean, if you look him up, this is usually the first video you'll see. Type in Jordan Peterson video. This is usually number one. This is why. But this happens to him. We showed in the clip. This happens to him quite a bit. This is the worst example of it. The average is better, but it still happens. So in a conversation about who is he and why do people not understand him, it's important to understand how these conversations tend to go.
In that they can exert tyrannical control over others. That's not power. That's just corruption. Power is competence. And why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a competent partner. So if you want domination,
want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No, I'd say women who have had their relationships impaired, their relationships with men impaired, and who are afraid of such relationships will settle for a weak partner because they can dominate them. But it's a suboptimal solution.
Do you think that's what a lot of women are doing?
I think there's a substantial minority of women who do that. And I think it's very bad for them. They're very unhappy. It's very bad for their partners, although the partners get the advantage of not having to take any responsibility.
But what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
Okay, you said it was making them miserable.
Yes.
Those are not the same thing. And the reason I'm stopping here, and I'm going to stop a lot, that's why we've scheduled 2 hours for this show. If you're not in the mindset of really sitting down and listening, you're going to say, well, it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. They have different implications. And he gets accused of word salad a lot. He gets accused of equivocating a lot. And there's a reason he made that distinction. No relationship is perfect. And we suffer our own inadequacies in various relationships, and sometimes this is what individual people need or get stuck with or end up with for any number of reasons. He's a fucking clinical psychologist. This is his bread and butter. This is what he deals with. What he's saying is it's not a good idea. It's not about whether you're unhappy dominating men, and he even says repeatedly dominating people is a lot of fun, which I think, by the way, takes some balls to admit on camera, but for the most part I think is true. And if you disagree with me, watch any liberal honing a conservative in a debate, and you're going to be enjoying yourself. There's a reason people like Christopher Hitchens, and it's not because he's a warm, cuddly kitten. So everything he said is absolutely true of men and women, and he's going to go into it, but this is off the rails. So unless you have something specific as Andrew, I'll try to move forward, but that's as a debater, that gets me. All right, let's go back. All right.
Those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Right, so you're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men.
I didn't say they were unhappy dominating men. I said it was a bad long-term solution.
Okay, you said it was making them miserable.
Thing. Yes, it is. And it depends on the time frame. I mean, there's intense pleasure in momentary domination. That's why people do it all the time. But it's no formula for a successful long-term relationship. That's reciprocal, right? Any long-term relationship is reciprocal, virtually by definition. So,
let me put a quote to you from the book, where you say there are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. These are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women. But then I want to put
minorities too dominate.
Okay, sure.
And women.
But I want to put to you that here in the UK, for example, let's take that as an example, the gender pay gap stands at just over 9%. You've got women at the BBC recently saying that the broadcaster is illegally paying them less than men to do the same job. You've got only 7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
So it seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
It does seem that way, but multivariate analysis of the pay gap indicate that it doesn't exist.
But that's just not true, is it? I mean, that 9% pay gap, that's a gap between median hourly earnings between men and women.
But
that exists.
We've had this discussion before. We did an entire thing. So the women's soccer team claimed that they were being discriminated against based on sex. I don't believe that's true. I think we've proven it wasn't true. We had a show on it. They were offered the same contract as the men. They said no. What they wanted was the benefits of their contract and the male contract. We've covered this, but I want to say this. The gender pay gap, and this is something people tend not to understand. They think that it has included all of the things that she's using in its inclusion. It hasn't. All the gender pay gap is a correlation between gender and how much money you're making. It doesn't explain how or why that correlation exists and doesn't take into account any number of factors. So, for example, what she's about to say is, shouldn't women be paid the same amount for the same work? You don't know. The gender pay gap doesn't say the same work. So if, obviously, it's including, for example, men tend to work more overtime than women by a significant margin. So if you're working overtime, you get time and a half. So even if you have the exact same rate of pay, the exact same rate of pay, the gender pay gap will show a difference between men and women if the men are all working overtime and the women are not by choice. It will show that. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't a gap. This isn't to say that there aren't problems. This is to say that when you look at the gender pay gap, it's not saying the same. It doesn't say based on how much they're working. It doesn't say based on the kind of work. It doesn't account for any of that. All it says is, I can tell you how many people died on just about any given day by how much ice cream was eaten that day. I absolutely can. It's been done before. It's not that hard to do. People sit there and say, that's insane. That can't possibly be true. How is ice cream killing people? I didn't say ice cream was killing people. It's got nothing to do with it. It's got to do with the temperature. As it gets hotter outside, more people go outside. They go swimming, they go biking, they get into car accidents because they're going on vacation. We have more vacations in general in the summer because that's when people want to go out. The roads have more car accidents, more people are dying, more people are drowning. People are dying of heat stroke, and more ice cream is being sold. So there's a very, very close correlation, and you can watch. It's cute when you see it. How much ice cream is being sold and how many people are dying on that day. It's a very tight correlation. It's been there for quite some time. There is no causality. You can't sit there and say, we need to deal with the ice cream problem because so many people are dying when we sell ice cream. Well, yes, people are dying when we sell ice cream, but if you use that as a statistic to say that there's a problem because of the ice cream, those are two different things. So when you say the gender pay gap, if you're talking about the actual difference between genders, this correlation, then yes, there's a gender pay gap. If you are saying the gender pay gap, but using that to say this is what women are getting paid less than men for the same work, that is not what that statistic shows. You can look it up. There's any number. I should have linked a source to that. That's one of the few sources I didn't link. We will include that in there. But that is what the gender pay gap shows and does not account for any differences at all. It just says if you take the average amount that a woman is earning and the average amount that a man is earning. Nothing else is put into it, and it doesn't say or not say anything about sexism because there could be any number of reasons. That is his point here. And Xander, you think I'm missing anything?
No, I think that covers it really well. I mean, she's making a very broad statement about a simple observed statistical fact and completely disregarding whatever the causality is. This isn't a topic that you can really just say, oh, well, because there's this 9% difference apparently in the UK, that ergo women are just simply being paid less than men. They're not listing. You can't make it that simple because there's a multiple variables, very complex, and you have to do very complex variable analysis to figure out why. And you need to know why these things exist before you can do anything to try and solve them, if in fact they actually need to be solved. I mean, I would think that would be the very first question you'd want to ask: is this something that needs to be solved? So, I see that a lot. There's a whole bunch of people that have tried to make this argument against somebody makes the same thing. You do a multivariate analysis, and it shows that the pay gap is not nearly as big a thing as people make it out to be.
Well, and she's about to do some sleight of hand here. I've seen this 100 times because I've gotten into this argument 100 times. This isn't because she's being dishonest. It isn't because she's mean. It's not even because she's ignorant. It's because she feels passionate about the issue, so she's going to start to conflate something. What she's about to say is, it doesn't matter why the gap exists. Well, if you're willing to say that, then yes, there's this difference, but we don't know why and we don't care why. But then she's about to say, well, it does matter because of X, Y, and Z, and she's gonna, and it's this sort of sleight of hand where it's like, well, this pay gap exists and there is a difference regardless of reason. If you want to say that, okay, fine. But then as soon as you start to say a reason, it's like, wait, I just thought you said regardless of reason. The actual pay gap is about a correlation, not causality. So when you say the gender pay gap, you are talking about the actual correlated data. It exists. If you're talking about the discrimination of men and women and what that causes in terms of difference in pay, it probably exists. It almost certainly exists, but it is a very small fraction of that overall number. And he's going to get into what some of the other causes are, but that's hard to do when you can't get off the initial point. So we're going to go back a sec and talk where he starts to talk about the pay gap. And remember, the pay gap is a correlation. And that you can't. The correlation does not imply causality. That's the first thing you learn in psychology. And she's using it. She admits it's a correlation and says, "Let's ignore the causality for a second." And he's like, "Well, okay, but what she's going to do then is beat him over the head with what she believes. Well, you've admitted it exists, not in the causal way. Those are two different claims." So when he says it doesn't exist, he means the how it is used in common parlance, which is to say, the gap caused by overt sexism. It probably does, in fact, exist, but it's much smaller than that figure than she quoted. And it has to be for any number of reasons that we'll get into some other day.
Paying them less than men to do the same job. You've got only put a quote, modern stroke neo-Marxist claim that Western culture in particular is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women. But then I want to put
minorities too dominate.
Okay, sure. But I want to put to you that here in the UK, for example, let's take that as an example. The gender pay gap stands at just over 9%. You've got women at the BBC recently saying that the broadcaster is illegally paying them less than men to do the same job. You've got only 7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
So it seems to a lot of women that they're still being dominated and excluded, to quote your words back to you.
It does seem that way, but multivariate analysis of the pay gap indicate that it doesn't exist.
But that's just not true, is it? I mean, that 9% pay gap, that's a gap between median hourly earnings between men and women.
But there's
that exists.
Yeah, but there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is gender, but it's not the only reason. Like if you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis. Like you say, well, women in aggregate are paid less than men. Okay, well, then we break it down by age, we break it down by occupation, we break it down by interest, we break it down by personality.
But you're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top, because that's what's skewing that gender pay gap, isn't it? You're saying, well, that's just a fact of life. Women aren't necessarily going to get to the top.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
You're saying
I'm saying there are multiple reasons for it.
Yeah, but those reasons, why should women put up with those reasons? Why should women be content
I'm not
not
saying
to
that
get
they
to the
should
top?
put up with it. I'm saying that the claim that the wage gap between men and women is only due to sex is wrong. And it is wrong. There's no doubt about that. The multivariate analysis have been done. So
Well,
I can give you an
you
example.
keep on talking about multivariate analysis.
Let me give you an example.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists. Now,
Yeah, but
if
you
you're a
have to say
woman,
why
that
it
seems
exists
pretty
repeatedly.
unfair.
You have to say why it exists.
But do you agree that it's unfair? If you're a woman...
Not necessarily.
And on average, you're getting paid 9% less than a man. That's not fair, is it?
It depends on why it's happening. I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait known as agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And agreeable people get paid less than less agreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men.
Again, a vast generalization. Some
It's
women
not
are
a
not more
generalization.
agreeable than
Yes,
men.
that's true, but that's right. And some women get paid more than men.
So you were saying that by and large, women are too...
Okay. he makes arguments that, in my view, utterly obliterate her. He does at least three of them. There's the first. So she's sitting there going, well, you're making a generalization because there are exceptions. Yeah, and there's exceptions to her argument, too. So when she talks about, well, women get paid more than men, not all women. So, there's it seems to me to be a double standard that she's applying here. But he's made his first point, which is he said, yes, gender plays a role. And he's admitted that and he said that. But he's saying there are other things to take into account. We've discussed some of these things. There's a diagram. There's a very useful diagram of how pay is, we just see pay over time. And one of the interesting things is the more you have, the more you can make faster, and the faster you can go up on the in the corporate ladder. The problem is women have one distinct biological advantage. It has nothing to do with gender or discrimination. It's a biological disadvantage, which is if they get pregnant, they're going to have to deal with that somehow. With any luck, they're in a country that, they can get an abortion and they actually have the choices to deal with it the way they want to. They can give the child up. But they have to, you cannot ignore that. And if they decide they're going to have the child, they will have to take some time off. That on average occurs at the time when somebody's career is just taking off. And so you can sit there and say to yourself, well, that's not fair. The reality is part of any career is networking. It's talking to people. And if you take 6 months off for any reason, and what they found is when men take the same amount of time, they suffer the same consequences as women who took that time off for the family. So now the question is it gender or is it something else? Do we need to be telling people you can't discriminate and the fact that women are earning less is proof that you're discriminating? Or do we need to say, hey, wait a minute, how do we make it so women don't have to either take that time off or that there's some other solution? Because the problem isn't that they're being discriminated against, at least in that case. And again, it's very easy to say, okay, so you're saying that women aren't being discriminated against. No, he already said they are, but that is one factor. And it's been my experience that if you're going to try to fix a problem, any problem, you have to understand it, which means you have to understand all the things that are contributing to this. But she has said, okay, they're illegally paying men less than women, and you end up in a suit and you say, well, it's illegal. Well, it's happening a lot less than it used to, and the reason is because it's illegal, and most of the time when it's happening, it's for some other factor. So they're saying it's illegal. Well, it's only illegal if you're not paying them and they have the same competence and same skill and same all these other things. Then yes, it's illegal. So the question is that what's happening, or is there something else that is disadvantaging them? Like this issue. And they can't, there's nothing, a woman cannot, that's why birth control is considered one of the most important tools in the empowerment of women, because all of a sudden, at least they have a choice now about when, but they still have less than a choice than men because they've got the biological clock. So that is not a discriminatory issue. It's an issue. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be addressed. How will you fix it and address it if you're looking at the wrong problem? You need data, and you need to look at it openly. And I don't think she's doing this because she's, disingenuous per se. I think they're disingenuous arguments here. But I think he's trying to explain a larger problem, and I think she's missing it. And he's right here. I don't agree with a lot of the things he says. He's right here. We've had this conversation. We've had the show. We'll link it down in the bottom. He's right. And we've covered the stats, and we've covered, and Netflix went on with a number of. We're not going to. I'm already getting into the arguments. Any other thoughts, Andrew?
We're really starting to get into what you're saying issue that this interview is rife with. You want to kill yourself, play a drinking game, and every time she says, so what you're saying, take a shot. You'll be dead before the interview gets halfway through. She has a very, very, very bad tendency to take something that he says that even sometimes is simply an observation, and then so what you're saying is, and then she puts in her own desire for what she wants him to have said. And then he spends a lot of time trying to correct her on those things, like, no, I'm not saying these things. So this is something I think journalists really need to watch out for. Don't ascribe motive to people. Listen to what they actually say.
Yeah, she's putting words in her mouth. And I want to address one thing. So it does come down to sex. Nobody said it didn't come down to sex. The question is, does it come down to discrimination? Those are two different things. If there is a reason other than an employer saying, well, you're a woman, so, then it's not discrimination. Now, there's a point there that employers take all of this into account when they're hiring. Yes, and it's illegal, as it should be, and it must be fought. it's not the only thing, and it's not even the largest contributor to that gap. It probably was before it was made illegal. The fact that it's illegal has not stopped it, but it has reduced it dramatically, and it isn't the biggest factor to that gap. Nobody said it wasn't about sex. What he's arguing is discrimination isn't the biggest factor. If women have a biological problem that is hindering their ability to do it, perhaps we should address that instead of discrimination, unless discrimination is the biggest part of that gap. If it is, then let's address that. But I think we should understand what it is. He's not saying it's not sex. He's saying it's not discrimination. Once again, it requires genuine, active listening to hear what he's saying, and she makes that impossible at this point. She's going to start telling him what he's saying a lot, and he is not saying those things. He's not even implying them. This is about to go off the rails. This is nothing yet.
You're going to get to the top.
And by the way, I'm not saying, I did at one point say I agree, and I think he's right about a couple of things, but I will oftentimes elucidate what he's saying. Doesn't mean I'm agreeing with him. It just means I understand his argument.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
You're saying
I'm
it's
saying
a
there
fact
are
of
multiple reasons for it.
Yeah, but
and they
those
aren't being
reasons,
taken into
why
account.
should women put up with those reasons? Why should women be
put up with it?
content
I'm not
not
saying
to
that
get
they
to
should
the top?
put up with it. I'm saying that the claim that the wage gap between men and women is only due to sex is wrong, and it is wrong. There's no doubt about that. The multivariate analysis have been done. So I can give you an example.
You keep on talking about multivariate analysis.
Let me give you an example.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists. Now,
Yeah, but
if
you
you're
have
a
to say
woman,
why
that
it
seems
exists.
pretty unfair.
You have to say why it exists.
But do you agree that it's unfair? If you're a woman,
Not necessarily.
and on average you're getting paid 9% less than a man, that's not fair, is it?
It depends on why it's happening. I can give you an example. Okay. There's a personality trait known as agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And agreeable people get paid less than less agreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men.
Again, a vast generalization. Some
It's not
women
a
are not more
generalization.
agreeable than
Yes,
men.
that's true, but that's right. And some women get paid more than men.
So you were saying that by and large, women are too agreeable to get the pay rises they deserve.
No, I'm saying that that's one component of a multivariate equation that predicts salary. It accounts for maybe 5% of the variance, something like that.
So surely
you
the
need about
answer-
you need about another 18 factors, one of which is gender. And there is prejudice, there's no doubt about that, but it accounts for a much smaller proportion of the variance in the pay gap than the radical feminists claim.
Okay, so rather than denying the pay gap exists, which is what you did at the beginning of this conversation, shouldn't you say to women, rather than being agreeable and not asking for a pay rise, go and ask for a pay rise? Make yourself disagreeable with your boss.
Oh, definitely, there's that. But I also didn't deny it existed. I denied it existed because of gender.
Okay.
See, because I'm very, very, very careful with my words.
So the pay gap exists, you accept that, but you're saying, I mean, the pay gap between men and women exists, but you're saying it's not because of gender, it's because women are too agreeable to ask for pay rises. So
It's one of the reasons.
Okay, one of the reasons. So why not get them to ask for a pay rise?
I've
Wouldn't
done
that be a
that.
fairer
I've done
way of
that
proceeding?
many, many times in my career.
And they just
I've
don't?
counseled. Oh, they do it all the time. You can. So one of the things that you do as a clinical psychologist is assertiveness training. So you might say, often you treat people for anxiety, you treat them for depression, and maybe the next most common category after that would be assertiveness training. And so I've had many, many women, extraordinarily competent women in my clinical and consulting practice, and we put together strategies for their career development that involve continual pushing, competing for higher wages, and often tripled their wages within a 5-year period, teaching
you
them how to
celebrate that?
negotiate. Of course.
So
Of
do
course.
you agree that you would be happy if that pay gap was eliminated completely?
It
Because
would
that's all
depend.
the radical feminists are saying.
It would depend on how it was eradicated and how the disappearance of it was measured.
And you're
These
saying if
things you
it's at
can't-
the
you
cost
can't-
of men, that's a problem.
Oh, there's also
When the hell did he say anything even close to if it's at the cost? Oh, okay. I'm going to continue. I'll be good.
sorts of things that it could be at the cost of. It could even be at the cost of women's own interests. So
Because they might not be happy if they get equal pay.
no, because
Okay. I have never met a human being alive who has said that somebody would be unhappy with equal pay. They might be unhappy with what they'd have to pay to get it, or the cost of it, or all the. She literally just said, so, essentially they'd be unhappy with equal pay. He's not making the claim. He's not suggesting that. That's unhinged, and that's in my view as a journalist, this is where she commits the most egregious error to date. He never suggested that, and that's a deliberate, not a deliberate. I don't think it's deliberate, but it's a straw man of his argument. It's wholly unacceptable, I think.
It might interfere with other things that are causing the pay gap that women are choosing to do.
Like having children.
Well, or choosing careers that actually happen to be paid less, which women do a lot of.
But why shouldn't women have the right to choose not to have children, or the right to choose those demanding careers?
They do. They can. Yeah, that's fine.
But you're saying that makes them unhappy, by and large.
I'm saying that no, I'm not saying that. I actually haven't said that so far.
You're saying it makes them miserable.
No, I said that what was making them miserable was having weak partners. That makes them miserable.
Right.
I would say.
One more time.
A quick point.
Please.
The women's soccer team is a very good example of what he's talking about the cost. They were offered the exact same deal that the men got, and the risk involved with that they didn't want to undertake, because the risk was they could make $0. So they negotiated for something that gave them some guarantees, which ended up, had they, now with the ability of looking backwards in hindsight, they could say, well, we should have taken the other deal because we could have made more money. But they don't know that looking into the future. So there can be some other risks. They chose the package that they wanted. So this is an example of some of the things that he's talking about.
So especially the women wanted a salary instead of paid solely on performance, which means they'd still got bonuses, but their bonuses were significantly less than the men, who were paid only on bonus. No health care, no insurance, the men got no. If they got kicked off the team, they did not get unemployment. They got nothing. They got paid per game that they played. They were not salaried, and on the year that all of it was canceled because of COVID, the men were paid $0. The women were paid on average for that year. The average female soccer player got, I think it was $106,000. $106,000. They didn't play a single game. I will tell you right now, based on how she is characterizing that, I would say unequal pay for equal performance. None of them played. The women got $106,000 on average that year. The men got $0. Why? Because the men had a contract that said if they win the World Cup, they get all this money and all this other stuff, but they didn't even play. The women said, I ain't doing that. I want to secure, and they negotiated. They rejected that contract and negotiated their own. If you look at those numbers, and that's why it got thrown out of court. And then when the men, when they started winning, and then they were winning like crazy. They deserve as much money as they can get. But when they're like, well, if we had the men's contract, we'd be making loads of money. Yeah, you'd have made $0 the last year, just like the men did too. They rejected the men's contract, and when they were offered it, in fact, told that they would not be able to get their own contract in the future, and there was only going to be one contract between men and women, so this didn't come up again. They rejected that and went back, and with the clause in the old one that allowed them to renew their old contract, they renewed the sexist old contract in favor of going for the new one that was identical for men and women. I think this needs to be considered a little bit more. At any rate, what he's saying here is that women do tend to choose jobs that pay less and yada, yada, yada. And now she's like, oh, so you think that's, he's not saying it's a good thing. He's not saying it's a bad thing. He's saying this is one of the problems that's contributing. She asked him, what's contributing to this? He's answering, and then she's saying, so you think that, and it's like, and she did that with the agreeability. Well, then why not teach women to be less agreeable? Yeah. That's what he does. There's agreeableness training. You need assertiveness training. Any clinical psychologist, well, that's a big field for one of these reasons. This is going off the rails. Going off the rails fast.
Those demanding careers.
They do. They can.
Yeah. And this reminds. So one of the things he said too is egalitarianism isn't when 50% of the CEOs are women, when 50% of the doctors are women or men, because right now women outstrip doctors in that. When 50% of the bricklayers are women, when 50% of that's not when you have egalitarianism. You have egalitarianism when every gender and every race, every minority can pick and choose their own career and have an equal opportunity to everybody else financially. in terms of being free from any kind of discrimination of any kind. That's what he's for. So honestly, it seems to me that she and he agree on 90% of this. They just disagree on whether or not you can use the outcomes as an effective measure. And what he's saying is you can't. He has reasons for that, where he will get into them a bit. But he has said time and time and time and time and time again, and you can find this all over the place, and he writes about this, it's best for society. It's best for every single minority, majority. It is best for all human beings if everybody has equal opportunities, and if a woman is treated no different than a man in terms of the opportunities she gets for education, for a job, any career she wants, because that's how you find the best people for the job. That's his position, and that's what she's arguing against right now. Tell me I'm wrong. Said it a dozen times. This is awfully contentious when I think that she wants exactly the same thing he does. And he's made very good arguments for why we should do it.
The disappearance of it was measured.
And you're saying if it's at the cost of men, that's a problem?
Oh, there's all sorts of things that it could be at the cost of. It could even be at the cost of women's own interests. So,
because they might not be happy if they get equal pay.
No, because it might interfere with other things that are causing the pay gap that women are choosing to do.
Like having children.
Well, or choosing careers that actually happen to be paid less, which women do a lot of.
But why shouldn't women have the right to choose not to have children, or the right to choose those demanding careers?
They do. They can. Yeah, that's fine.
But you're saying that makes them unhappy, by and large.
I'm saying that no, I'm not saying that. I actually haven't said that so far.
You're saying it makes them miserable.
No, I said that what was making them miserable was having weak partners. That makes them miserable.
Right.
I would say that many women around the age of, I would say between 28 and 32, have a career family crisis that they have to deal with. And I think that's partly because of the foreshortened time frame that women have to contend with. Like, women have to get the major pieces of their life put together faster than men, which is also partly why men aren't under so much pressure to grow up. So because for the typical woman, she has to have her career and family in order pretty much by the time she's 35. Because otherwise the options start to run out. And so that puts a tremendous amount of stress on women, especially at the end of their 20s.
I think I take issue with the idea of the typical woman, because, you know, all women are different. And that's what I want to just put another quote to you from the book.
Well, they're different in some ways and the same in others.
Okay, you say women become more vulnerable when they have children.
Oh, yes.
And you talked in one of your YouTube interviews about crazy harpy sisters. So, simple question. Is gender equality a myth in your view? Is that something that's just never going to happen?
It depends on what you mean by equality. No,
Being
if you
treated
mean
fairly,
men and women,
getting the same opportunities?
Fairly, we could get to a point where people were treated fairly or more fairly. I mean, people are treated pretty fairly in Western culture already, but we can improve
They're really not, though, are they? I mean, otherwise,
Well,
why would there only be 7 women running FTSE 100 companies?
Stop here. He said Western civilization. Now, this is our first introduction to him saying something that seems like, well, gee, it's a big claim and yada, yada, yada. He used Western civilization. That's a technical term. He's not pulling that out of thin air. That's a technical term. So the second he says in Western civilization, what you have to realize is he's comparing that to every other civilization. If you compare women in Western civilization, he is absolutely correct. It is undeniable, and I have never met a sane human being who could argue against it. If you were to line up every civilization that has existed since the dawn of man, roughly 100,000 years ago, all of them, and you were to ask anybody which one they would prefer to live in, I think it'd be hard-pressed to find white, male, female, anybody like that, who would argue that this is not the country you'd want to live in and the place you'd want to live in it, because or at least a Western country, because for all its faults, and there are a great many, and he's not trying to say we should ignore them, it's still the most egalitarian time in human history that I'm aware of. So when he says it's reasonably fair, pull a woman out from just 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, bring them into modern times right here, right now. I think they're going to agree with him. One of the interesting things about people, and this is why we are so able to solve problems, is because we do this, is because we're adaptable. And the smaller the differences become, the more we exaggerate them. Skin color is a meaningless distinction, and yet to some people, it's the world. If we were at war right now, nobody would care. During World War II, skin color was dropped reasonably fucking quickly. Tuskegee Airmen, at one point, yeah, they had problems when it started, but by the end, they're like, you know what, we want to live. So since the best air wing in human history is black, I don't care about the color of their skin. I want to live. So these distinctions we can only have when things are going well. And when things are going well, then it's like skin color is a big deal. It's not in a war. It's not in a foxhole. You get over that shit pretty quickly. So he's right. And I know it sounds dismissive, but the words Western civilization is the tip-off that he is speaking on a different scale of granularity than she is. She is talking within Western civilization and what the problems are there. They're big if you're looking within Western civilization and the context of it. If you jump out to the history of the world, they're reasonably fucking small. You have in your pocket, all of us, men, women, a device that is more powerful than what got the Apollo program to the moon. We're actually doing reasonably well. And he pointed something else out. Well, I'm not going to get into that. But is Andrew, any thoughts?
I think, she's asking a lot of questions and then assuming his answers. And when he gives her the answer, she doesn't like it. So you're saying this. And, so it's like, yeah, it's kind of difficult. It seems to me like she's not really listening to what he's actually saying, except to find the little kind of catchphrases that she can latch onto and put her own meaning into it. I just don't see her really listening to him.
I think somebody just said he's being evasive. Again, I've been to a lot of science conferences. My wife has a PhD in biochemistry, so I go to these conferences a lot. I see her present. I see other people present. He's being exactly as evasive as just about every scientist I've ever seen. And again, Sam Harris made this exact observation. They will hedge, they will guard, they will say, well, this, and this. And this is actually the kind of behavior I personally tend to expect from somebody who's being very precise and is used to having his words taken out of context and being beaten over the head with it. You have to be careful, because if you misspeak even once, and as someone who's misspoken more than once, and you will, so he's going to get nailed. It's a question of, can he reduce the amount that he's destroyed in, because it doesn't take much, as anyone who's ever been in public knows. So I think he's being careful.
Fairly, we could get to a point where people were treated fairly or more fairly. I mean, people are treated pretty fairly in Western culture already, but we can improve
they're really
that.
not, though, are they? I mean, otherwise, why would there only be 7 women running FTSE 100 companies in the UK? Why would there still be a pay gap, which we've discussed at length?
That's easy.
Why?
100 years ago, there were no women running any corporations anywhere, which is his point.
Why are women at the BBC saying that they're getting paid illegally less than men to do the same job? That's not fair, is it?
Let's go to the first question. Those are complicated questions. Seven women, repeat that one. There's
7 women running the top FTSE 100 companies in the UK.
Okay. Well, the first question might be, why would you want to do that?
Why would a man want to do it? I mean, there's a lot of money, it's an interesting job.
There's a certain number of men, although not that many, who are perfectly willing to sacrifice virtually all of their life to the pursuit of a high-end career. So they'll work. These are men that are very intelligent. They're usually very, very conscientious. They're very driven. They're very high energy. They're very healthy. And they're willing to work 70 or 80 hours a week, nonstop, specialized at one thing to get to the top.
So you're saying women are just more sensible. They don't want that because it's not a nice life.
I'm saying that's part of it, definitely. And so I work
you don't think there are barriers in their way that prevent them getting to the top of those companies?
Oh, there are some barriers, yeah. Like men, for example. I mean, to get to the top.
Okay, so again, he's already said, too, that sexism is absolutely a barrier. He's not saying there aren't barriers. He's giving examples of other problems besides those barriers, because that's what she asked. And when he gives those, she says, so there are no barriers. No, he's already said there are barriers. He said it more than once. An interesting thing, over 90% of all psychopaths and sociopaths are men. We can get into the hows and the whys of that. There are theories. There's some evidence as to how and why. That's the way it is. It also turns out that one of the best indicators of what's a good trait for a CEO lines up pretty well with pathological behavior. Now, I have a number of problems with this, and the fact that it's all men could be an indicator, although it's mostly all men as CEOs, could be an indicator of another problem other than just sexism, quite frankly, if it turns out that the best qualification to be a CEO is that you're a psychopath. But then that's the issue. Are there still barriers other than that? Absolutely. Absolutely. But that's a job that, for whatever reason, is tailored to psychopaths. And there are more psychopathic men than women. Both of those are pretty well established in psychology right now. Both of those facts. So when you sit there and say, why are there almost no women? There are still, and this isn't the only reason. This may not even be the biggest reason, but it is a reason. And there are a lot of reasons. So if you have a job that is tailored to psychopaths, and most men are psychopaths, you're going to have a problem getting women into, not most men, that's debatable by a lot of people. But at any rate, most psychopaths are men. I can tell you what's going to happen in terms of the competition for those jobs. Most men are going to get it. Now, you could sit there and say, well, gee, we should change. And I think all that should be on the table. Nobody's saying we shouldn't. He's talking about the reasons. He is not evaluating whether they're good or bad. And when she asks him to, he tries, and then she puts words in his mouth. Is Andrew, any thoughts?
No, I think we can carry on to the next part.
All right.
A nice
I'm saying that's part of it, definitely. And so I work
So you don't think there are barriers in their way that prevent them getting to the top of those
there are some
companies?
barriers, yeah, like men, for example. I mean, to get to the top of any organization is an incredibly competitive enterprise. And the men that you're competing with are simply not going to roll over and say, please take the position.
So let me come back to my
absolute
question.
all-out warfare.
Is gender equality a myth?
I don't know what you mean by the question. Men and women aren't the same, and they won't be the same. That doesn't mean they can't be treated fairly.
Is gender equality desirable?
If it means equality of outcome, then almost certainly it's undesirable. That's already been demonstrated in Scandinavia. Because in Scandinavia...
What do you mean by that? Equality of outcome is undesirable?
Well, men and women won't sort themselves into the same categories if you leave them alone to do it of their own accord. We've already seen that in Scandinavia. It's 20 to 1 female nurses to male, something like that. It might not be quite that extreme. And approximately the same male engineers to female engineers. And that's a consequence of the free choice of men and women in the societies that have gone farther than any other societies to make gender equality the purpose of the law. Those are ineradicable differences. You can eradicate them with tremendous social pressure and tyranny. But if you leave men and women to make their own choices, you will not get equal outcomes.
Right, so you're saying that anyone who believes in equality, whether you call them feminists, call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't going to happen.
Only if they're aiming at equality of outcome.
So you're saying give people equality of opportunity, that's fine.
It's not only fine, it's eminently desirable for everyone, for individuals and for society.
Okay, that's the game. That's the game. I want to know what the goal is here. I think the goal should be that men and women should have the same opportunities. And when I say same opportunities, I'm including all of it. So I'm including in education. I'm including in terms of what jobs are available to them. I'm including all of it. So you can say, well, but you can't give the same opportunities because they don't get the same education. Well, then they need to get the same education because I'm arguing for the same opportunities. Men, women, every minority, all the same opportunity. If that's your position, which he just said is his, I don't understand why that's not the ballgame. I thought that's what feminists are looking for. They're arguing by a metric that he disagrees with and says you can't use to measure fairness, and let's just worry about everybody getting equal opportunity across the board, also in terms of once you're in the job, equal opportunity for raises, equal opportunity to become CEO, across the board. He just said that's what he wants. He said that's desirable for everybody. I've made the argument repeatedly myself why that is. He's made the argument why that is. Why is this not the ballgame? Why are we not done? That I don't understand. Is Andrew, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's a really important distinction between, equal opportunity and equal outcomes, because equal opportunity will not lead to equal outcomes. And in order to get equal outcomes, the amount of well, as he put it, tyranny and social engineering that you have to do is mind-boggling. So it's an important distinction.
And he used Scandinavia. So last I heard, I thought it was 5-1. It's actually greater than that. I don't think it's 20-1. But okay, Scandinavia has done the most of any country in human history. Or Scandinavia is not a country; it's 3 countries. But the region has done more than any other country. And what has happened is, the more egalitarian it gets and the more they really encourage that men and women can be anything they want to, the greater the divide. Men say, wow, I really want to do X, Y, and Z. And they pick usually more dangerous careers. They pick careers that do involve more aggression. They pick careers that tend to be involved with things because, men tend to like electronics and cars and stuff like that. And it turns out that might not be sociological, whether it is or isn't so far. That's what they're doing when you're giving them free choice. And they have more free choice than ever, and that's what they're doing. Women are becoming doctors and nurses and doing all these other things. Now, maybe we should pay doctors and nurses more. I'm all for that. I'm a biggie on that. I don't think they should get their bills, but that's not what's at issue here. What's at issue is what happens if you say all men and women can pick any job they want, and all of a sudden it turns out most men are actually picking certain kinds of jobs, like, again, ones that are outdoors or involve, any kinds of, I've met a lot of men who genuinely want to be in the military. I've met very few women who want to. It does happen. Now, is that because women are being discouraged? Maybe. But so far, again, when women are being encouraged, now have they been encouraged for generations and generations and generations? No. So there's research to be done, and this isn't, but so far, and what he's saying is when they're out there and they have complete freedom to do whatever they want, they are not 50% choosing 50% of every possible occupation. Men are more willing to do bricklaying than women are. Men are more willing to do manual labor than women are. There are women who can do it. There are women who are better at it than most men, and there are women who enjoy it. But the numbers are lower. And that I wouldn't think would come as a shock, but just because my life experience isn't necessarily. And again, he's already talked about the differences, right? We're actually talking a small amount of difference. It's a small difference, but at the extremes, which is usually what happens when you pick jobs that you're interested in. If there is a genuine difference between the kinds of things that interest men and interest women, then left to their own devices and given true freedom, men and women will tend in different directions. Just tend. I'm not saying they have to. So he's taking one step out of the equation. He's saying, let's not assume men and women will make the same choices. And if they do, great. If they don't, fine. Freedom is about letting them choose. So he's about the freedom, not about what happens after they've been given that freedom. Let them do what they want. That's what he's fighting for, which strikes me as what every feminist is fighting for. And she's saying, well, unless you get exactly equal outcomes, there's a problem. How do you know that? What study have you done to that other than what he talks about? We've defined this down at the bottom, which is this idea that these differences between what men and women are interested in is purely cultural. And it's like, okay, so you got to fix the cultural problem. Okay, but you don't know that. And there's evidence to suggest it isn't. So why, if we fix opportunity, both sides are happy. That both sides want that. I don't see I don't see why that hasn't ended the conversation. All right, I'm going to go. I'm a little triggered.
Call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't going to happen.
Oh my God. Okay. He did not say they should give up, and he has said that it's important that they continue to. This is the exact opposite of his position repeatedly. And no, this is not what a journalist should do. A journalist should not take your position and say that you're saying the opposite. A good journalist asks hard questions. They don't invert what you're saying.
And that's a consequence of the free choice of men and women in the societies that have gone farther than any other societies to make gender equality the purpose of the law. Those are ineradicable differences. You can eradicate them with tremendous social pressure and tyranny, but if you leave men and women to make their own choices, you will not get equal outcomes.
Right, so you're saying that anyone who believes in equality, whether you call them feminists, call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't going to happen.
Only if they're aiming at equality of outcome.
So you're saying give people equality of opportunity, that's fine.
It's not only fine, it's eminently desirable for everyone, for individuals and for society.
But still women aren't going to make it. That's what you're really saying.
It depends on your measurement techniques. They're doing just fine in medicine. In fact, there are far more female physicians than there are male physicians. There are lots of disciplines that are absolutely dominated by women. Many, many disciplines. And they're doing great. So
let me put something else to you from the book. You say the introduction of the equal pay for equal work argument immediately complicates even salary comparison beyond practicality for one simple reason. Who decides what work is equal? It's not possible. So the simple question is, do you believe in equal pay?
Well, I made the argument there. It's like it depends on who defines it.
So you don't believe in equal pay?
For fuck's sake.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Because a lot of people listening to you will just say, I mean, are we going back to the dark ages?
That's because they're actually not listening.
I'm
They're just
listening very
projecting
carefully,
what
and I'm
they think.
hearing you basically saying women need to just accept they're never going to make it on equal terms. equal outcomes is how you defined it.
No, I didn't
If I
say
was
that.
a young
said
woman
that equal-
watching that, I would go, well, I might as well just go and play with my Cindy dolls and give
didn't
up
say
trying
that.
at school because I'm not going to get the top job I want because
said
there's
that
someone sitting there saying it's not possible and it's not desirable, it's going to make you miserable.
Desirable. That's what I said. It's a
Yeah,
bad
it's not
social
desirable.
goal. I didn't say that women shouldn't be striving for the top or anything like that, because I
said the
don't believe
opposite
that for a
repeatedly.
second.
Striving for the top, but you're going to put all those hurdles in their way, as has been in their way for centuries, and that's fine. You're saying that's fine.
No, I really
The
think that's-
patriarchal
I
system
really
is.
I want to say something unequivocally. This is no longer an interview. He has not said that. He has said the opposite of that. He has said that repeatedly. If she's researched any of his positions, he has argued eloquently against everything she just said is his view. This is not an accurate representation, and she appears to have no interest in accurately representing him. And again, I don't care if you agree or disagree with him. Please disagree with him. That's fine. I am not defending him. I am defending the fact that his positions are not only not being represented, but he is being told what they are, and as the opposite of what he has argued repeatedly on hundreds of hours. These are not his positions, and that's why he's laughing. She's not listening, and she's already made up her mind about what his views are. And when he seems evasive and seems to be getting around it, no, he's clarifying what he said time and time and time again. And she's just saying, well, no, but that can't be what you mean. Because you're a misogynist and all these things, and I want to paint you that way, apparently. I don't think it's conscious. But.
Women shouldn't be striving for the top or anything like that, because I don't believe that for a second.
Striving for the top, but you're going to put all those hurdles in their way, as has been in their way for centuries, and that's fine. You're saying that's fine.
No, I really
The
think
patriarchal system is just
that's
fine.
silly. I do. I think that's silly. I really do. I mean, look at your situation. You're hardly unsuccessful.
Yeah, and I have battled quite hard to get where I've got to.
Good
So that's
for you.
okay. Battling is good. This is all
It's
about the
inevitable.
fight. But you talk about men fighting. I mean, let me just put another thing to you from the book.
Why
You're
wouldn't
saying
you have to
real.
battle for a high-quality position?
Well, I notice in your book you talk about real conversations between men containing, quote, an underlying threat of physicality.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
What about real conversations between women? Is that something, or are we sort of too amenable and reasonable?
No, it's just that the domain of physical conflict is sort of off limits for you.
Well, you
it's
just said
rather
that I
unfortunate.
fought to get where I've got.
Yeah, but
what does that make me?
Well,
a sort of proxy man or
I
something?
don't imagine that you've. Yeah, to some degree, I suspect you're not very agreeable.
So that's the thing. Successful women. I'm not very agreeable.
Right.
But
I've noticed that
successful-
actually in this conversation.
At least
and
we
I'm
can have
sure
a
it
joke about
served your career well.
Successful women, though, basically have to wear the trousers, in your view. They have to sort of become men to succeed, is what you're saying.
Well, if they're going
I've had to fight to succeed,
if they're
therefore
going to
I'm an
compete
honorary
against
man.
men, certainly masculine traits are going to be helpful. I mean, one of the things I do in my counseling practice, for example, when I'm consulting with women who are trying to advance their careers, is to teach them how to negotiate and to be able to say no and to not be easily pushed around and to be formidable. And you need to, if you're going to be successful, you need to be smart, conscientious, and tough.
Well, here's a radical idea. Why don't the bosses adopt the male bosses, shall we say, adopt some female traits so that women don't have to fight and get their sharp elbows out for the pay rises? It's just accepted if they're doing the same job, they get the same pay.
Okay, that's
Well,
a straw
I
man.
would
That's
say
an
partly
extraordinarily
because it's
bad
not-
straw man. It's already accepted. It's already part of the law that they get. And he is saying they should get the same pay for the same work. That's not the point. And if you're on salary, then how aggressive you are is going to have nothing to do with it. If you have to negotiate, then it does. But then it's not about sex. It's about your ability as a negotiator. And that's what he's saying. You will negotiate better if you're aggressive. That is a complete straw man. Shouldn't it be accepted? It's already accepted. He has granted that it should be accepted. It is already law. That is not what we are talking about. We are talking about negotiated positions. And that it has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with how aggressive you are. And we showed data on this prior. Men who are not aggressive get paid the same amount when you pull the other, if they have the same as any woman, as any, everything else is the same. And the only difference is aggressiveness versus agreeableness. Men and women are making money tantamount based on that trait, not gender. There are other obstacles. We remove those obstacles and talk just about agreeableness, and there is no distinction between what men and women are earning. And a disagreeable woman will earn the same as a disagreeable man, and vice versa when you're taking disagreeableness as the factor being measured. It's the disagreeableness. Now, she's got a decent point. It's worth listening to, but that's worth getting into.
Trying to advance their careers is to teach them how to negotiate and and to be able to say no and to not be easily pushed around and to be formidable. And you need to, if you're going to be successful, you need to be smart, conscientious, and tough.
Well, here's a radical idea.
In every
Why
field.
don't the bosses adopt the male bosses, shall we say, adopt some female traits so that women don't have to fight and get their sharp elbows out for the pay rises? It's just accepted if they're doing the same job, they get the same pay.
Well, I would say partly because it's not so easy to determine what constitutes the same job.
But that's because, arguably, there are still men dominating our industries, our society, and therefore they've dictated the terms for so long that women have to battle to be like the men.
No, it's not true. It's not true. So, for example,
where's the evidence?
Well, I can give you an example very quickly. So I worked with women who worked in high-powered law firms in Canada for about 15 years, and they were as competent and put together as anybody you would ever meet. And we were trying to figure out how to further their careers. And there was a huge debate in Canadian society at that point that was basically ran along the same lines as your argument, is that if the law firms didn't use these masculine criteria, then perhaps women would do better. But the market sets the damn game. It's like...
And the market is dominated by men.
No, it's not.
Okay. It depends on the market, and they're going to conflate the market in just a second. No. The market is dominated by the consumer. And when you're talking about the legal... It's not men who dominate the market in the legal, when you're talking about law. It's the people who need lawyers. I have a question. It's a very simple question. You are falsely accused of murder. You're looking at jail for the rest of your life. 3 people have falsely testified against you. It is a difficult case. You have a choice of 10 lawyers. We're not going to talk about the sex, gender, or anything of those lawyers. What we're going to talk about is how aggressive they are when defending their client, and they are sorted that way. Will you ask about their gender or not? My suspicion is you will not, and if you're saying you will, in my view, you're probably lying either to me or to yourself. I don't think a man is going to ask. I think a man wants to get off. I don't think he wants to spend his life in jail for something he didn't do. He's going to get the most aggressive fucking lawyer he can. Period. She's smart enough, she should realize this. She doesn't care. And if it happens to be a woman, you're not going to care either. And if you're a woman, you're still going to get the most aggressive lawyer. So if you accept, which you don't have to, but nobody's challenged it yet, she's not challenging this point. She's challenging another point, so to the point that she's challenging. If you accept that women are more agreeable, and by a percentage that he's already discussed that we showed in the intro. It's actually a small amount. It's a reasonably small amount, but again, at the extremes it matters. If women are in fact less agreeable, you can sit there and say, well, we're going to make you choose a lawyer that's less aggressive because we're trying to encourage feminine traits, but is that what the client's going to want, and is that what they're going to pay for? The market is the people who want lawyers, and I can tell you they don't care about gender usually, unless they're stupid. They care about getting off, so they will take the most aggressive lawyer they can. So the women said, no, the market is set by people who need lawyers, and they've spoken. They want the aggressive ones. She is wrong, period, end of discussion. Is Andrew, any thoughts?
No, not yet.
Thank you. All right.
Dominating our industries, our society, and therefore they've dictated the terms for so long that women have to battle to be like the men.
No, it's not true. It's not true. So, for example...
Where's the evidence?
Well, I can give you an example very quickly. So I worked with women who worked in high-powered law firms in Canada for about 15 years, and they were as competent and put together as anybody you would ever meet. And we were trying to figure out how to further their careers. And there was a huge debate in Canadian society at that point that was basically ran along the same lines as your argument, is that if the law firms didn't use these masculine criteria, then perhaps women would do better. But the market sets the damn game. It's like...
And the market is dominated by men.
No,
so
it's not. It's not.
You,
the market is dominated by women. They make 80% of the consumer decisions.
Okay,
that's not the case at all.
If you're talking
80%.
about people who stay at home looking after children, by and large, they are still women. So they're going out doing the shopping. But that is changing.
They make all the consumer decisions.
Okay, so
the market is driven by women, not men.
Right.
Okay, and if you're a lawyer in
Canada... And they still
Canada,
pay more for the same sort of goods.
She just
That's
changed
been proven, that men, you buy a blue
He's right, she
bicycle
ignored his
helmet
point.
is going to cost less than a pink one. Anyway, we'll come on to that.
It's partly because men are less agreeable. Right, so they won't put up with it.
I want to ask you, is it not desirable to have some of those female traits you're talking about? I'd say that's a generalization, but you've used the words female traits. Is it not desirable to have some of them at the top of business? I mean, maybe there wouldn't have
They
been
don't predict
a
success.
banking crisis.
They
if
don't
that
predict
happened.
success in the workplace. The things that predict success in the workplace are intelligence and conscientiousness. Agreeableness negatively predicts success in the workplace. And so does high negative emotion.
You're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No, I didn't say that at all.
You said that female
said it's a
traits
factor,
don't
he didn't-
predict success.
But I didn't say that
and
intelligence wasn't. I didn't say that
conscientiousness do.
intelligence and conscientiousness
Well, you were saying that
weren't
intelligence
female
and
traits.
conscientiousness by implication are not female traits.
No.
No.
I mean,
I'm not
that's very
saying that.
dangerous territory.
I'm not saying that at all.
Are women less
There's-
intelligent than men, by and large?
No, they're not. No, the data on that's pretty clear. The average IQ for a woman and the average IQ for a man is identical. There is some debate about the flatness of the distribution, which is something that James Damore pointed out, for example, in his memo, but there's no difference at all in general cognitive ability. There's no
This is
difference
his
to
field.
speak of in conscientiousness. Women are a bit more orderly than men, and men are a little bit more industrious than women. But the difference isn't big. But
I know
that
plenty of-
averages into
Plenty of men
conscientiousness.
who aren't necessarily as
Well, of
industrious.
course.
But we'll,
these are-
we'll,
okay.
we'll,
But no,
female
but
traits,
you asked me
though,
the
why
question.
are they not...
Feminine traits,
Why
let's
are they
say.
not desirable at the top of... Feminine traits, why are they not desirable at the top of business?
It's hard to say. I'm just laying out the empirical evidence. Like we know the traits that predict success.
But we also know, because companies by and large have not been dominated by women over the centuries, we have nothing to compare it to. It's an experiment.
True, and it could be the case that if companies modified their behavior and became more feminine, that they would be successful. But
You
there's
seem
no
doubtful about
evidence
that.
for it. I'm not neither doubtful nor non-doubtful. There's no evidence
So why
for
not
it.
give it a go, as the radical
Because the evidence
feminists would
suggests,
say?
well, it's fine. If someone wants to start a company and make it more feminine and compassionate, let's say, and caring in its overall orientation towards its workers and towards the marketplace, then that's a perfectly reasonable experiment to run. My point is that there is no evidence that those traits predict success in the workplace. And there's
Because it's
this
never
evidence
been
is-
tried.
Well, that's not really the case. Women have been in the workplace for at least ever since I've been around. The representation of women in the workplace has been about 50%. So we've run the experiment for a fairly reasonable period of time, but not, certainly not for centuries.
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No,
I want to
that's
ask-
not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
Huge distinction that she has ignored. He has never once, that I'm aware of, and again, I've seen a lot of complaints, he has never once been accused in his time teaching at Harvard, in his time teaching at the University of Toronto. He was never accused of misgendering someone deliberately, ever. There were no complaints. There was 500 videos of him teaching before any of this, before any of the gender issues came up. Nobody has ever, to the best of my knowledge, levied a claim. Now, if you want to just hook him because you don't like him, you can sit there and say, well, that doesn't prove he didn't do it. Of course he didn't. That's why you're innocent until proven guilty. You can't prove he hasn't committed murder either. And you could sit there and say, well, the only reason he's never been tried for murder is because, hey, he killed all the witnesses. You can say that. I can't prove you wrong. That's not critical thinking. And that isn't trying to actually understand. And all I said at the beginning was, let's at least understand him. If you don't like him, great. Understand the position, and then you can take it down. There's no harm in understanding it. He has never been accused of deliberately misgendering someone. He said that he would deliberately violate a law, and to the best of my knowledge, the law has gone into effect, and I still haven't heard that he actually did it past that. But there's a very big difference between saying that he was deliberately misgendering some people or that he was for any reason. And he had never been accused of that before the law, even after the law, so I don't know if he followed through with his threat. There are serious problems, I think, with his position on that. I agree he's right. The law was inexcusable and a huge problem in ways that people haven't even begun to think about, but I don't think his approach was right. But nonetheless, I haven't heard anyone, and he's on video repeatedly saying that he's always properly gendered people, and all his students have said that they were properly gendered. All his trans students have said that. So no, he has never been accused of misgendering anyone. What she said is not true. Is Andrew, I assume you have a few things to say on this. I may, shut up.
In this particular case where we're coming up, what the issue was, in this case happened to be pronoun usage, but it could have been around any particular group at all. It wasn't the group that was relevant. It was the law compelling speech that he disagreed with. And he said that multiple times. So it ended up falling in because transgender issues are becoming much more mainstream. You know, they're being dealt with a lot more. They've a lot more notoriety about them. So yeah, a lot of people bring it to the front. So, you know, that happened to be the issue that was being dealt with when they passed the bill C-16. You know, and one of the, I think, possibly, you know, valid criticisms was that Jordan Peterson was misunderstanding exactly how Bill C-16 was supposed to function. Whether he did or not, I mean, go read the actual bill and what it was supposed to do. Plus, you know, there's some other documents like the Charter of Rights and things, and the Human Rights Tribunal documentation that you have to read with it as well. But you know, you can read the relevant literature, and you can find out, you know, if you agree with his assessment of what the law actually was or not. Some people have said that they thought that he got it right, that he was arguing the correct things. Some people have said not. I have not gone through and read all of the Ontario Human Rights documentation or the Charter of Rights, or, you know, so yeah, I can't say definitively one way or another whether he got it right. The point he's making about government compelling what speech you must use, I think he's got a very good point, and I agree with that 100%. I don't believe the government should cross that line into compelling what speech you must use, and that conflated quite a lot with you know, the government telling you what words you can't use. You know, like using racial slurs, for example. And there's a huge difference between saying, well, you can't use a racial slur versus, no, you must use these words. You know, and then people like to drag in, you know, it's like, well, words change usage over time, which is true, and it happens organically and naturally, you know, where the majority of the population, and it usually happens a little bit slower over time. It's never legislated. So, you know, there's a lot of conflations on.
That would need its own show. The reality is that is the first step in any kind of cultural revolution. If that word sounds familiar to you, that's what happened with Mao, and when they said there are certain ways that you must speak to people, and that's also what some of the and this is why it gets conflated with Marxism and neo-Marxism, and they talk about this. It's extraordinarily dangerous to start doing this. Ask yourself, why are we doing this? If we're doing it because trans people deserve rights. A lot of people deserve rights. This isn't including all people who are being bullied. Trans people have a much higher rate of suicide. There's a reason for that. It's not because they're trans. It's because they're being bullied. And anybody who has to go through what they're going through, trans or not, goes through this. So the problem is that first of all, it's a bigger problem than just trans. And there are plenty of people who don't have to suffer bullying behavior, but there are plenty of people who do. If this law said you are not allowed to bully any minority and not allowed to engage in certain, well, actually, so now I've just made the mistake, right? Because I'm talking about what's prohibited. If you are required to recognize people's whatever it is, and whether it's gender, you know, there's any number of things you can attack onto this. The problem is the only reason to do that, I have to believe, is to control thought. If you control language, you control thought. This is what Orwell was talking about. This is how it starts. It's how it started on, not so much under Lenin, but certainly under Stalin. This is how it started in Mao's China. And everybody thought they were doing it for a good reason. If we can do this, we can enforce respect. The problem is, I have never known a person who respected somebody more because they were ordered to use certain language. It's not about respect. It's about protecting a minority that needs to be protected. So let's not say that there's a reason they have a higher suicide rate. This is a huge problem. But forcing people to use certain words isn't going to add the respect. It's not going to, and we played that clip earlier too, it's not about respect. And the question is, what is it about? What are we trying to achieve? And will we really achieve it? And that requires an honest discussion that I don't think anybody's had, because the intent of the bill is actually good. I agree. The intent of Bill Clinton's bill to put every American in a home was awesome, and was the spark that started the 2008 financial crisis. Intent is not a get-out-of-jail-free card, A, to talk about the consequence, or A, to there being consequences, and B, to at least having an honest discussion about them. I disagree with a lot of things he did here, but he's right about that. All right. Any other thoughts that you can inspired?
Yeah. One of the things, it's like, you can read it and you can decide whether he was representing the bill correctly or not. All of the stuff's there for if you care to know exactly what the bill says. Porpoise dropped a link. You can go read the bill. Just decide if he misrepresented it or not. Even if he misrepresented it, the concept of compelling speech is a very dangerous one, and that one that he rallied against a lot. And the difficult part in this whole thing is because we are talking about a marginalized segment of the society, and there's some definite problems. And one of the problems with the problems that we're having is we don't necessarily know definitively what the absolute best solution is. We're still trying to find the best solutions, and that leads a lot of people into very ugly areas. So it's a very difficult topic to talk about because there's a lot of people that are just like, well, I just don't agree with it, period. So you're just wrong. And that's not particularly useful either. So all of this is surrounded by a very difficult topic where real people are being harmed. And you can't forget that real people are involved in this. So, we have to keep in mind to that as well.
That's a great point. And I'm going to tack on one more thing just to bring it back to the whole point of this show. Isn't to say he's right or wrong, but this is why you need to listen. And I will point out, several people have said, and I haven't seen the live chat, so maybe somebody said it in the live chat, maybe not. It'll come up if it hasn't. Well, he's misrepresenting it. Maybe not. But the link that we dropped that has his testimony also has the testimony of a lawyer who testified with him. This lawyer is an expert in human rights in Canada. He has been practicing law for I forget how many years, and he testified that Peterson had this correct. Now, that's okay. That's one lawyer's opinion. But since the lawyer is more qualified than any of us, anyone who says he's not correct either hopefully has studied the law and is aware, or is just going off of what they've heard from other people too. So again, and there's been some complaints, well, this is not his field of expertise. Anybody who's ever said that he's wrong about the law, it wasn't their field of expertise too. And the only expert I've ever seen testified before the Senate in Canada and said he's right. It doesn't mean he's right. It doesn't. I'm aware of that, and that needs to be remembered. But anyone who says he's wrong, unless they're a lawyer, I'd like to know where they got that from. And if it's their read of the bill, fine. But a lawyer who's an expert in human rights in Canada testified that he's right before their Senate. And he wasn't disbarred. So I think he must have had at least an argument, maybe. So if people are criticizing Peterson for speaking outside of his field of expertise, which actually he's not, that's why we included some of this is maybe pushing it, but, that's another argument. But there are lawyers who this is their field of expertise, and they agree with him. So I don't think it's as easy. I think it's hard to but I think it's very hard. I think it requires more than just he's wrong. I think this is a harder conversation. So let's continue.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
Not
to
once
outlaw
it was law.
discrimination.
No. Well, that's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. Like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
gotcha.
You have got.
He's right. A journalist, presumably. Yeah, please.
I would like to point out that I know it goes a little bit beyond just this interview, but he did a few interviews after this where they discussed this interview, And he has expressed that he thought he handled that particular part where he says, "Ha, gotcha," poorly. He regrets that. He wished he would have been able to come up with a bit better. And he was, after a bit more time to think about it, he did say, "I wish I had said this," which was a little bit more gracious. So I just wanted to point out that he did at least say that he felt he handled that not as well as he could have.
If he's he's an educator, at least in principle, right? Because he's a teacher. I think a real educator has certain values, whether they're teaching or not. So you can't say he's an educator just because he's a teacher. But if he's an educator, then he cares less. He cares. You have to be magnanimous when you get somebody as an educator, because the point isn't to beat them. The point isn't to make them look bad. It's to make them think. So what he went back on this and said, look, as soon as I said, "Ha, I got you," that was an emotional reaction. I was ticked off. It was a tough interview. The only one who seems to have lost control so far is her. And she literally just made the argument. I mean, to me, this is mind-blowing. And again, this is at least the second time now that he said something that is just, or that she said, why should your right to not be offended trump, or sorry, why should your right to speak trump somebody else's right not to be offended? I imagine when a reporter said, "Nixon, are you a crook?" that was offensive. That a reporter could make that argument. She wasn't even thinking at this point. She's just attack, 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 attack. So, oh, all right. Well, yeah, we're going to keep going. We are going to keep going regardless. So, all right, let's keep going. You and I, as Andring, thank you for the notice. We will move on anyway. So let's go.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah. It took a while.
It did. Yeah.
It took a while. You have voluntarily come into the studio and agreed to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's
she.
never happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No. I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law. That's what I said. And then the people who came after me said, "Oh, you must be transphobic and you'd mistreat a student in your class." It's like, I never mistreated a student in my class. I'm not transphobic, and that isn't what I said.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that grossly...
Well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian, which they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right.
Okay, so he is called trans activists. He has compared them to other leftists who have done terrible things, and starting with Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao was in charge of the Cultural Revolution, which the idea was the culture was corrupt against the bourgeoisie. So in China, they took the elites, and at first it was just, okay, they're not allowed to do certain things, they're not allowed to talk a certain way. There was it was a cultural revolution. The culture needs to be changed because the bourgeoisie, the people who are getting rich, are actually, they themselves are the problem. And it went from that to restrictions on them and what they can say and do, to ultimately killing huge numbers of them. And the same thing happened in Russia. And the point that he's made is, well, they say, well, that's not true left, that's not true neo-Marxism or Marxism. And I understand the argument. We can get into that. I think that's for another time. I think it's never true when it fails, right? So, well, people betrayed it. Yeah, or is there a time? Porpoise brought this up, and I thought this was a great point, which was Marxism kind of seems to assume that people are going to be good, and they're not. That's why it fails. So if it ends up failing, and they say, well, that's because people broke the system. Yeah, that's why it fails. So he's making this argument that as soon as you start doing these things like this law, that was his objection to this law. And again, I'm not aware of him ever deliberately misgendering anyone. And he has repeatedly said, and he was asked about this, we have the clips there also in the bottom, one of them timestamped, about specifically a trans woman came on and said, what would you call me? And he said, she. Now, then there are people who say, well, he's just saying that because he was put on the spot. He doesn't strike me as a person who cares about not, about, I mean, you can't sit there and say he's inflammatory deliberately and lied because he was worried about being put on the spot. He doesn't strike me as the kind of individual who really cares what you think. And if he's really looking for subs and views, he'd have said, I'm going to call you he. That's not what he did. None of those things are his argument. Xander, any thoughts?
Well, and he's also talking about there's an important difference because people have brought this criticism up, especially in regard to this, because he does mention, that it's like, well, the trans activists, which are kind of a minority, very loud minority, that are pushing for trans rights. And he's pointing out that, hey, they didn't come together and hold a big election. It's like you're pushing for trans rights. Some trans individuals agree with you, some don't. And so that this isn't you can't just say, well, I represent all trans people until you get all of them together to vote. Is kind of his point that he's trying to make there. And he also makes the point several times that it's like I've had a lot of trans people write me letters, email me, tell me in person, that they don't feel that he's attacking them personally. It's like just some of the methods, some of the ideologies of some of the trans activists have steps in them that are also steps in some of the authoritarian regimes that we've seen. And he kind of talks about how those are together and they're kind of the same steps. It's kind of like saying, well, you have to, it's like all people are this. It's like, well, not necessarily. It just means that there are some overlap in some areas. It doesn't necessarily mean that the trans activists are in danger of becoming Maoists, though he says that he points out that there is a possibility of it because we see some of these same steps in both of these cases. Now, is he actually right about that? I'm not entirely convinced, but it's something that you need to pay attention to and at least understand the argument, because if you don't understand the argument of what he's actually saying, you can't really counter it. At least not effectively actually counter. You can just call him transphobic and just be done with it and walk away. And I don't think that's particularly effective. So, this is a really important area to get down right what he's actually saying and understand the arguments of what he's actually saying, and don't try and just paint it with a broad brush.
And let's also add one other point. I think this is important because Porpoise brought up something close to this, and I think this has to be mentioned. He has said other things in other interviews that I look at that and I was just like, if I apply the maximum charity that I can, I have a very hard time reaching the conclusion that he's not transphobic. Now, I haven't gone into depth of those. Maybe there's something I don't know. I try to maintain an open mind, but at this point, again, and I think this is important. I'm not trying to make the argument that he's transphobic, that he's not transphobic. Porpoise did not. Porpoise did not contest this. So I'm also not saying this because Porpoise contested this. The point is whether or not he's transphobic is probably important in a number of circumstances and may be important in this discussion. But so far, the arguments that he's making are not along those lines. And, a transphobic person can still make a good argument. And we may not like that. Nobody's perfect. And whether or not he's transphobic it would be its own show. What we said at the beginning of this was we were going to talk about the arguments that he's making and how they are being interpreted. If she has an argument as to why he's transphobic, and she may, I can think of a couple that haven't been brought up. She should bring those up. She should absolutely bring those up. That's not what's happening here. So it's just one of those things, again, where it's like, you have to take each sort of situation on its own and go after the arguments that he's making. So he may well be transphobic, and there may be loads of evidence for that. I haven't seen it in this interview. And so to talk about, because this show is about how at least it appears. If you just saw clips of this interview, you could walk away with any kind of impression depending on which clip you chose to show. We're going over the entire interview. It's very hard to see. We got the entire interview linked originally down at the bottom so you can take a look at it. I am not making the claim that he's not transphobic. I did make the claim, and I stand by it, that nobody has any evidence that he deliberately misgendered anyone. That doesn't mean he's not transphobic. That just means he hasn't deliberately misgendered anyone. So, this is why this is not easy. This is very technical, and we're getting into exactly what is being said and what is or is not being implied by it. I'm going to make mistakes. He's made mistakes. We all, but there's absolutely evidence, in my view, to support a claim that he's transphobic. she hasn't presented any, and his arguments here have struck me as being reasonably sound. Anything else, Xandri?
Nope.
All right. We're getting there. We're almost done.
Grossly
Speak for
insensitive
their whole
to
community.
compare them to Chairman Mao or, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, this is grossly insensitive. Isn't
I
it?
didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
he
Mao.
was an authoritarian.
He's a
wasn't he?
right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians. And
Okay,
I do believe they are left-wing
Mao,
totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just
That's
saying these
murderous-
things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean,
Not
you
a
are a
bit.
provocateur.
I never said
You're like
anything-
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as when I say what I believe to be true, it's provocative. I don't provoke. Maybe for
You don't
humor
set out to
now and
provoke.
then. I'm not interested in provoking.
I'm pausing now just because it's a good time. I do want to address one quick thing in the live chat. Homophobic technically means scared of gay people. But this is an example of language, again, changing. And we use so many words. And I had a list in my head of just great, like, if you take what this word means by the etymology, it's like something utterly fucking insane. They're like, well, that's not what it means now. That's not. But that's a great example of words that change over time. I don't think it's credible anymore to say that, well, he's not afraid of trans people, so he's not homophobic. Homophobic... I understand what the words are, and I understand what hydrophobic is, and it can mean a lot of things, but it no longer means culturally, whether you'd like it to or not, whether you want to stick to the etymology or not, is all irrelevant. Culture has moved on. Words do change meaning over time, and sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't. It is different than demanding people speak a certain way. But that word no longer means scared of gay people. It means bigoted towards gay people. So homophobic is, and arguing the etymology I don't think is particularly productive. Homophobic, transphobic doesn't mean you're scared of trans people. It means you're bigoted against them. And you may be actually transphobic and have trans friends because you may still be bigoted. You may or may not be aware. And it's a very complicated issue. But I'm not sure arguing the etymology is particularly productive. I don't think there's many people who would say that culturally it doesn't mean bigoted towards. So again, unless Xandri has something else that he wants to add to that, I just wanted to drop that because it was in the live chat. I was like, that's worth saying. We're almost done. We're getting there.
No, it can be good to point out that the usages of words change, and sometimes they can change fairly rapidly. It started with homophobic, and then as that was used to describe bigotry against gay people, then it's spread very quickly to other areas such as transphobia, which is a logical next jump. So it took a little bit longer for transphobia to catch on, but the word usage has changed culturally. So.
All right.
But what about the thing about, fighting and the lobster? Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back. And it's an injunction to be combative, not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
I quit. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done, folks. That's it. Civilization has come to an end. So he was saying that hierarchies aren't actually like the existence of a hierarchy. What the hierarchy is, who's in charge, is a social construct. But the idea that there are hierarchies, and the kind of Marxist idea is, no, we can go without a hierarchy. And what he's saying is, and he's combating that idea. And what he's saying is, all animals have hierarchies. I think for the most part, maybe there's one that doesn't, and I'm thinking about, but his argument appears to be that you find hierarchies in human nature and in the nature of all animals going back going back millions of years. You go back far enough. And even so far back that you find a lobster and you find that even they've got a hierarchy. That's his point. And her takeaway from that is that he's saying we should model our society after lobsters. That was her takeaway from that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty disingenuous. She's just looking for some way to counter this argument, because I don't think she really understands what the biological argument that he's making. And of course, he's not a biologist, and he states in many times, that he got the information from biological studies, from biologists that were publishing studies that were talking about the hierarchies of lobsters and how the nervous system of lobsters works, and that the fact that lobsters have a serotonin mechanism as well as human beings, and that the basic structures, the fundamental building blocks of those nervous systems are very similar between lobsters and humans, so similar that antidepressants will work on lobsters as well as they do on humans. He's not trying to conflate human beings with lobsters.
He is not saying we should model society after lobsters, folks. He's really not saying that. Well, I'm gonna have to say it again. Lobster, the delicious taste of hierarchy. I'm sorry, I love that. Oh dear Lord. Okay, we're almost done here. Let's make it down the home stretch. I just get that's. I'm sorry. I don't think you can claim this is journalism. She's not listening. I don't actually think I'm going to disagree with you in the sense that I think what she's doing here is she's just in automatic mode. So there's a pattern to banter. There's a pattern to a discussion. There's a pattern of and if I'm out of it, I know I could give an interview in my sleep, right? I could just pick out and just say, oh well, that's interesting. Why don't you tell us more about this? And why don't you it's like I could do any number of things. It's like not every interview requires complete attention. I'm sorry, it doesn't. I'd like to try to give it anyway, but nonetheless, if you need to, if you're preoccupied, if you got a kid in the hospital, even whatever it is, you're not going to give your full attention. But you can do a lot of this stuff by rote once you're good at it. She knows how to give an aggressive interview, which, by the way, suggests to me that people are interested in seeing aggressive interviews. But all that notwithstanding, she's not listening to what he's saying. She's just saying, and by the way, in your drinking game, I think we're up at this point to 31, maybe 32. So you're saying, which is more than the number of minutes we've had in the interview. I think most people, anyone who's playing that game, he was not advocating for that. And if you're dying of alcohol poisoning in time is not responsible. He was not.
We did.
Yeah. What?
We did warn you at the beginning.
Don't
serious risk of death if you were trying to take shots every time. So what you're saying was mentioned.
And I want to be clear about something else. This was a bad interview, a very bad one. I don't think she's a bad journalist. I have no evidence as to whether she's a good or bad journalist, except I've got some evidence that she's a good journalist because she's worked for a lot of companies that hire good journalists. And I don't believe, there's probably sexism, and there may be, affirmative action kind of thing. I doubt it. I suspect she was hired because she's fucking good. So my assumption is that she's actually really good. This was an epic, catastrophic failure. And this is something I personally would be humiliated to have on. And by the way, I've done humiliating things before, so this isn't inhuman. This isn't a failure as a woman. This isn't a failure as anything other than this was, I think she had a personal bias. And by the way, this was the opinion of the New York Times afterwards. It was also the opinion of The Guardian, which is two of the top most respected papers in the world, and one of them in her own country, that said that she was biased, she misrepresented all of his positions. And again, they didn't opine on whether or not he was correct. But when the New York Times says you failed as a journalist, and when the Guardian says you failed as a journalist, I don't think it's very difficult to say you failed as a journalist. And this is, again, the worst example of what's sort of done to him in his arguments, and that they are difficult to understand. It's very easy to take them personally. But yeah,
I used to. I've seen this interview several times, and the first few times I kind of had that same issue that you were dealing with kind of being triggered, going, what are you doing? No, that is not what he's, stop and listen to him. So you kind of have that almost a bit of frustrated anger response with like, what are you doing here? What is the point of this? And I've gotten to the point now where I'm not really mad at it anymore. I'm a little sad, because you can watch how she interviews, not what she's saying, but the structure of how she does it. The fact that she doesn't let up on things, even though I think that she's pressing the wrong things. I think I agree with you. I think that she's probably a very good journalist, and I think that she has the potential. She has all of those things there to be an outstanding interviewer if she would listen. And I think it was a very big missed opportunity, because had she really listened to the arguments, perhaps maybe she needed to take a little bit more time to listen to his positions on all of these, so that she had a good understanding of what they were. I think she could have done a really good job pushing against what his actual positions were, and I think she could have gone a long way towards that kind of pinnacle of, is this right or is it wrong? And I think that she could have done a much, much better job. And I think that this interview was just essentially a fail. And we all fail, even at things that are really good. We all make mistakes. We can all be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's like this just happened to be, maybe it was an off day. Maybe she just had a bad day. I don't know. I'm not her. So, I would really like to see her come back and actually address his actual arguments, and not try and tell him what arguments he's making, and then get some really good pushback on them. I think that would be far more useful, because there's a lot of these issues that he's talking about where it's not just a foregone conclusion that he's right.
Yeah.
Neither one of us have sat here and said, I mean, we've made comments where he's talked about like what some of the literature says. No, that's just simply an observation. It's true. But the arguments he makes based off of a lot of those observations, it's like, we're not really saying, is he right? Is he wrong? We're saying, get to what he's actually saying, look at what he's actually arguing, and pay very close attention, because, he does tend to take very nuanced and multivariable approaches to all of these problems, which I might say are vastly complicated. Not easy.
Well, and even if he's wrong about a great many things, I'd like to get back to one of the original points I made. I don't think you can dismiss him. He has studied enough, and even if his interpretation of all of it is wrong, you're going to have to have studied at least some of this to argue against any of these points. He may be unhinged on any number of ways, but I don't think it's something where you can just sit there and either ignore it or casually dismiss. I think not just in this, but in a couple of the clips we've shown and other things he said, I don't think he's easily dismissed. And again, just to reiterate, I'll disagree on one other thing. I did on one occasion say he's right, because there's a few things they said. I'm just like, look, as a matter of fact, he just happens to be right. Whether his conclusions are correct, whether his overall argument is correct, I'm not opining on. He said things that are just right. Period. End of discussion. I can't, they're facts. I mean, if somebody wants to explain how and why they're not facts, I'd be open to it, because I'm so liberal that my head would actually fall out of my head. Yeah, but it's like there have been a few things, and I forget what any of them was, but I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I mean, I did point out that he's when referencing things like what the literature says, and the fact of there's many, for example, for the gender pay gap, that there's a multiple variables involved in that. It's like, yeah, we've said several times that, yeah, what he's saying is, I'm sorry, it's an observed fact. That is correct. but he's making arguments based off of those things. And it's the arguments that he's making that are really, really important. And the fact that in this interview, it didn't seem that she could even accept that some of these things are facts. She got really hung up on the gender pay gap. And it's like, well, wait a minute, he hasn't even really gotten to much of making any arguments at all. They never got past the what is it part of that. So, it's really a missed opportunity here.
There's a tremendous amount to unpack. This is why I also said, we are getting into some of his arguments because they're relevant, but if you really want to pick any of his arguments, and the one that really does concern me most is that Canadian law. But if you want to get into what is he and what is, first you have to be able to have a genuine discussion on what he's saying, and I think that's very hard. And this is a great example of it. And she's a professional, and she was having genuinely a very difficult time with it, in my view. And she's not the only one. We've already shown clips too of a lot of that going on, and that's common. That is more common than not. This is the worst it's been, and she handed him a victory because he can take this around and say, "Hey, look, everybody." So when you blow that kind of opportunity, and when you're not really listening and engaging, and again, this is a human thing. We've all fucking done this. So this is nothing, and I feel bad for her because this was done publicly. But that leads to the one other point, which is we're not allowed to misspeak anymore. And hatred has become so, it's like if somebody says, I did X, Y, and Z, you say, well, that contradicts you. It's like, well, I really meant it this way, this way, this way. They think you're retconning, or they think that you're post hoc rationalizing your argument. So one of the reasons he uses so many words when he's doing this is so that it's harder to accuse him of that, because he was more precise the first time around. And he says 10 times more words than necessary. I do this often too, but it reduces it when people sit there and take it either out of context, or they understand a different context and they say, well, it must mean this, this, and this. I was like, well, no, that's why I used a higher level of precision. And when you're in a hostile situation, you have to use a higher level of precision. And it looks like it's escape hatches and this and that. And by the way, if you're generally trying to make escape hatches and get out of an argument, you do the same thing. So it ends up being in part motivation, and so, okay, well, is he at this point being disingenuous? Well, it's hard to tell if you've already made up your mind that he is or isn't. It's going to support wherever you are. So again, in my view, if you're going to be critical about it, you have to sit and not go with the opinions of others who say he is or isn't, and take each claim he makes by itself. And that's the only way to do it. It sucks. It's a shit ton of work. And we've talked about before, you need heuristics to avoid having to do that, because there are 9 billion people on this planet. You can't do that with everybody you meet. But I don't think anyone can opine on him without doing that, which is, I think, the sort of the central point that we're making. Okay, let me we've got like 3 minutes left on this. So we're almost there, folks. And it's amazing that people have hung through from beginning to end. All right.
Logical construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example, because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures. It's absolutely inevitable. And there is 1/3 of a billion years of evolutionary history behind that. Right? That's so long that 1/3 of a billion years ago, there weren't even trees. It's a long time. You have a mechanism in your brain that runs on serotonin that's similar to the lobster mechanism that tracks your status. And the higher your status, the better your emotions are regulated. So as your serotonin levels increase, you feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion.
So you're saying, like the lobsters, we're hardwired as men and women to do certain things, to sort of run along tram lines, and there's nothing we can do about it?
No, I'm not saying there's nothing we can do about it, because it's like in a chess game, right? There's lots of things that you can do, although you can't break the rules of the chess game and continue to play chess. And your biological nature is somewhat like that, is it sets the rules of the game, but within those rules you have a lot of leeway. But the idea that, but one thing we can't do is say that hierarchical organization is a consequence of the capitalist patriarchy. It's like, that's patently absurd. It's wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It's seriously wrong.
Aren't you just whipping people up into a state of anger? And
not at all.
Divisions between men and women, you're stirring people up. You know, you have any critics of you online get absolutely lambasted by your followers. You've
and
got to
by
call
me,
them off,
generally.
haven't you? Sorry, your critics get lambasted by you. I mean,
If
isn't
they're
that
academics,
irresponsible?
not at all. If an academic is going to come after me and tell me that I'm not qualified and that I don't know what I'm talking about,
So
like,
you're
it's
not going to say to
seriously
your
not the
followers
same.
now, quit the abuse, quit the anger?
Well, we'd need some substantial examples of the abuse and the anger before I could detail that question.
There's a lot of it out there.
Let's take a more general perspective on that. So I have had 25,000 letters since June, something like that, from people who told me that I've brought them back from the brink of destruction. And so I'm perfectly willing to put that up against the rather vague accusations that my followers are making the lives of people that I've targeted miserable.
Jordan Peterson, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
I do read Russian, so if somebody wants to, all right. So yeah, who is that? Yulia Rudvana? I don't know if that's a legit question. She can understand that I'm talking to her, and so maybe she'll ask it. I don't know. My Russian's rusty, but I'll give it a shot. All right. Okay. I was not as composed as I'd like to be for this, but I was honestly a bit more composed than I thought. And I think it's because, for me, a trigger is to, I get triggered when it's funny. I don't get triggered by people who disagree with me. I really don't. No. But I do get triggered very easily with people who either aren't listening or who misrepresent my positions. And I get triggered. And the people who don't like me know this. They're very good at just sort of like, oh, so you're saying because that has an impact on me. It obviously he's got more resiliency to that kind of thing. And so I get triggered. I get a little, there you go. I hope this was a good show for most of you. I know some people found it very objectionable. That's what we do. When we covered the Evergreen State fiasco, the reason I covered that, and was because I was very concerned about where our culture is headed when that kind of thing was as acceptable as it was. And when you look at is Andrew, what was the name of the college, the jail experiment? Was it? And I want to say it was Stanford, but you know the one I'm talking about? Are you still there? Did I lose you? I may have, it's possible I lost him when we
I'm sorry.
There's another issue. It looks like we got another, which is fine. We're recording this show also, so if it goes down, we have a complete copy of the entire show. So
it's back up.
Yeah, perfect. I'm not going to worry about it. We're going to do our best. We're going to proceed regardless of any issues on YouTube. The entire show is being recorded. We record all our shows. We do a lot of controversial things, and I'm sorry. The prison experiment. Yeah, was the Stanford prison experiment. I know my brain is. I'm on like 2 hours of sleep, so I'm starting to fade. But yeah, and that showed what even liberal people do when they get powered. We're all human. There's much more that combine. There's much more. Yeah, no, I suspect we're being reported. In fact, I have almost no doubt we're being reported. So somebody is flagging us, and that's all right. That's perfectly fine. My suspicion is because it's all fair use. The auto system is kicking us back, which should be an indication that maybe we're okay. Whoever's flagging us may not care and just want to take us down, which is fine. But I don't think that's an indicator of a good argument. I am growing concerned. I was telling this, Andrew, I have a feeling that I felt only once before in my life, and I remember it very well. I was working on the Kerry campaign, which I don't normally talk about. I wasn't a bigwig there, and I'm so proud of my Obama work. But I worked as a political operative. I started volunteering with a number of campaigns pre-Gore. But I was working on the Kerry campaign, and the numbers were coming back, and it was looking better for Bush than anyone had anticipated it was going to. And I was on vacation. I was in Vermont, and bumped into a bunch of campaigners there because, hey, what am I going to do on vacation? I'm going to go hang out with the local campaign office in Vermont. And they were freaked out, and they were like, the numbers are looking like he might win. And I was just like, I don't think Bush is going to win. I don't think anyone wants another, 4 years of Bush. They're making Kerry work for it, but he's a war hero. He's all these things. I'm not really all that concerned. So, but if Kerry loses and if Bush wins, it would be the worst thing to happen to the Republican Party. And here's why. I started to talk about the dynamics of the Tea Party and a civil war that was going to happen in the Conservative Party, and on what grounds and why, and what it would do to them, and roughly when we'd see it, and it could maybe be at least postponed if Bush didn't win. But if Bush won, there'd be enough power there to do it. Now, if this party came to power, if this civil war happened, it would be great for Democrats because we'd own the next 8 to 12 years. Now, we did own the next 8 years after that. It had nothing to do with this civil war. It had to do with Obama and the quality of his candidacy. And I called a number of things about that wrong, including that it would just make life so easy for the Democrats because the Republican Party would be so fractured. They're fractured, but I forgot that they fall in line, and I've never seen a fracture so much that they won't fall in line enough that they're a viable party. The fracture is huge, and I'm concerned about it because the middle is getting eaten up. And I remember seeing this happening, and I remember seeing it like moves on a chessboard, 12. 12, okay, I'll check DMs and everything in a minute. 12 moves away. I was like, it's going to happen. And I know how and why. And I miscalculated what it would result in, but I was right. It happened. And in exactly the way I said, and roughly along the timeline I predicted. And I realized without even knowing it, I had made that same prediction again on the left. A civil war is coming on the left, and it's going to be I think it is going to be a lot about identity. I'm not going to get into how and why. I think the left is on the extreme end, just the extreme end. But that's where it started on the right, too. I think they've taken some of the liberal values too far. And I think they've decided that good intentions is a justification for doing all sorts of things, that equality is a justification for all sorts of doing just about anything. But those words have been used in the past to create atrocities, and we've talked about it. We're not going to do a show about it. Either you know what I'm talking about or don't. We referenced it more than once. Just because you're trying to be equal and trying to fix inequality, trying to eliminate the bourgeoisie or whatever, and just because you may have a bunch of good points, doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. There's more than one way to skin a cat, and I'm getting very concerned that the far left, again, you start taking a look at Evergreen State, and because these are my boys, right? This is I'm proud to be a liberal. People are probably sitting there saying, he's not as much of a liberal as I thought. If the far left has moved that far, that I'm starting to look like a conservative, I think that's a problem. But that's what's happened. I mean, is Andring's a liberal now, right? It can absolutely happen on the left, and it will. It'll take about 8 to 12 years from now before it's as bad as the conservatives are now. But that's what we're looking at. And I think we have to have honest conversations about the fact that, yeah, we're all on the same team and roughly share the same values, but some of it is getting out of hand. And this is what it looks like before you get a cultural revolution or things like that, and the laws start changing, and they start saying, well, in the name of equality is very important, but the ends don't always justify the means, and I'm growing concerned. I disagree with a lot of what this man says. I don't think he's being listened to, so it doesn't really matter what I think, and it doesn't matter what most people think because they may or may not have those positions accurately. I think it's worth listening to. I think it's worth at least understanding, and I think he's right about one thing. He seems to suggest that he's talked about why he likes the left and why we need the left and why they are important and why society cannot survive without them, and without them, we'd still have slaves and women wouldn't have the right to vote without the left. That's Jordan Peterson's argument. That's what this guy is arguing. He's made that argument before. He'll make it again. Referenced it at the beginning. So he's not some I hate leftists. And people have said, well, aren't you some I hate leftists? He goes, well, right now I'm more concerned about them for all these reasons, and make these arguments, and he attacks the right too, but mostly the left. Why? That's where he sees the problem. Okay, you agree or disagree, but I think he should be listened to. Agree or disagree, and I think the day that we decide that somebody is so repulsive, we're not going to bother to listen to them, we are becoming exactly what we've accused the conservatives of, and we will head down the same road where they are now. And that frightens me. And it frightens me when I was on Twitter a couple of days ago and I said, listen, when you stop talking and when you stop realizing, Joe Rogan is saying very dangerous fucking things, that has to stop. That has to be stopped. But I never said it didn't need to be stopped. I said there's more than one way to do it. And Porpoise was great in that discussion too and made some excellent points. And I think, I'm glad that we can have these conversations. They're getting harder. Getting harder with my own side. I can't criticize my own side. What's the fucking point? Is it just that we're going to go after each other? And so what I said was, when we stop talking about these things, that's when you get a civil war. And then I heard from multiple people that I care about on the left say, good, bring it on. People on the left. Now, this is Twitter. It's not but I realize I'm talking to people who are no different than the woman who I mock. And I think she deserves to be mocked. Who broke onto the Capitol steps, got maced, and comes out, oh my God, I was maced. Guy asks her, well, what were you doing? It's a revolution. Well, where were you? On the step inside the Capitol. So she broke into the Capitol, and she was lucky she didn't get 2 in the chest. She has no idea what a revolution looks like. She has no idea how many people after the last Civil War prayed to God it would never fucking happen again. When I hear conservatives say, yeah, let's do a civil war, I think, yeah, that's because they're conservative fucking idiots. Aside from the fact that they'd probably lose for all the reasons I've said before, they have no idea what a war really looks like. None. And when I hear liberals saying the same thing, I'm really worried. I'm not sure we have correctly identified who our real enemies are, and I think it's because it's easier to not run. This is the whole series of shows. This is practically the history of In Time, going back to the very first show, and I'm proud of that. That it's about talking about people that either we don't like or we don't agree with, but trying to fucking think about it. I am terribly sorry if anybody's been offended by this. I really am. That was not the goal. I stand behind this show. I stand behind everything that I remember saying. I may have said something out of context, and if I said something bad, let me know. I'll correct it. Stand behind his andering. I stand behind him being here and his comments. If I didn't, he wouldn't be here. I'm not going to end on that note, but since and I take this passionately too. This has nothing to do with Jordan Peterson. It has to do with values. My values are having these conversations and trying to understand people and trying to educate. I think it's as close to a mortal sin as you can get when you decide you're too good to listen to someone else. Xander, any final words?
Regarding Jordan Peterson, I've also watched probably as much of his videos as you have, trying to figure out what he's all about. One thing that I am at least confident of is that he does care about people. He does care about civilization, and he doesn't want it to go down in a blazing ball of fury. He has a lot of people that are devoutly in his corner, that devoutly follow him. They have people approach him on the street and say how his book has saved their lives, his lectures have saved their lives. And it's not an uncommon occurrence for it to happen. He's reaching quite a lot of people. You cannot ignore the arguments that he makes. And you need to first know what those arguments genuinely are. And if he's wrong, then we need to have good arguments against his arguments. I don't see that happening. I see lots of people that repeat all of these claims without really providing much in the way of evidence. And they're not countering, they're just calling him names. They're not countering any of the arguments that he says, oh, well, that just makes him a transphobe, or that just makes him a bigot. That just makes him this or that. He just vomits word salad over everywhere. None of those things counter any of the arguments that he's making. You either agree with his arguments, and you don't have to agree with all of them. Maybe you agree with just some of them. Or you disagree with them. And you need to come up with good arguments against the arguments he's making. Either way, you can't just ignore him because he's not going away. You know, he makes quite a lot of money because, as he puts it, he's an evil capitalist. So if you want a resolution to this, then you need to actually have the arguments. And I think we are slowly losing the ability to deal in nuance in favor of outrage. We're losing the art of arguing ideas in favor of cancellation. And I don't think that that leads anywhere positive. So don't just dismiss him and call him names. Listen to what the man says. Who knows, you might learn something.
We are more capable of losing this democracy than we think. It's almost happened before, and it could happen. And sometimes we've been really fucking close to it. That Canadian bill wasn't proposed here, and Canada has different laws and okay. We are dehumanizing each other, and we're doing exactly what I talked about at the beginning, which is we're taking very small differences. The difference between a modern conservative and a modern liberal is infinitesimal compared to a Confederate and a Union soldier, and those are infinitesimal compared to pick any two groups. We're doing well. It's not to say we don't need to fix a shit ton of stuff. We don't need to kill each other over it either, and that is the only difference between us and the Hobbesian state of nature. Is talking. That's the only difference. And on that, Peterson makes that claim, and I agree with that. And there are a lot of people who don't want to talk anymore, and the conservatives have made that crystal fucking clear, and they need to be held accountable to that, and there need to be laws, but we also need to say, how can we fix that and maybe reach them halfway? That's a liberal position. That was Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s position, meeting the racist that hates him halfway with dignity, and it's the only thing that's ever worked. If this is going to be the best country in the world, we have to do better than we've been doing. Everybody, the left included. It's a clip. I didn't want to show it. I did want to show it. That's why I was loaded. I decided 10 minutes into this I wasn't going to show it because it's just going to be, I'm trying to show whatever. No, I'm going to show it. Maybe you can see another side, and if you've made up your mind that we're wrong, then we're wrong. I'm willing to discuss any opinion I gave here. We do it in the Discord. It's all I do is argue with people all day. And I think most people who've argued with me will say I listen. So I'm perfectly happy to accept that I'm wrong about absolutely everything I've said here. But I will listen to it, especially, and as long as you understand what I'm saying, I'll keep talking. But that's because that's what I believe in. And we are losing that. And it's the most serious problem I see on the horizon. It's not Trump. I used to think Trump was the most serious problem on the horizon. Over the last few months, that's changed. And it's not liberals. But liberals abandoning really the core of their values, that is a huge part of it. And I don't think any of us should want a civil war. And if there ended up being one, I'd like to think that I'm going to stand up for my values. But dear fucking God, nobody should want it. And no. All right. Thank you all for watching. And I'm gonna drop by the Discord hopefully later on tonight. I've got a whole bunch of things I need to do. I know Zandring has things he needs to do. This has been a difficult show for a lot of people, so I get that. It's been difficult for me. Like I said, I got triggered. I got triggered for my own personal reasons. And, if you really think I've done something unforgivable, I hope you'd be willing to talk to me about it first openly and honestly. And maybe you're right. Maybe I didn't mean exactly what I said in the way you took it. That's a distinct possibility. Maybe I didn't. It's been my experience more often than not. If you're willing to keep talking, you reach that conclusion. And the people who've been talking with me on Twitter and here in this Discord, and the ones who have supported us despite sometimes having really strong disagreements, I appreciate with everyone. And I hope that is the hallmark of this show. It's always tried to be, just to be willing to have those discussions and admit when you're wrong. And I've had to do that at least the same share as everybody else. I don't think we've been wrong here. If we have, we'll correct it. That's what we do. And hopefully that's still a liberal value. Thank you all. We are currently planning an After Dark on Friday to discuss more of this, if we think we can do it and it not turn into a dumpster fire, which I suspect I've got enough control with. I'll be using vMix, folks. It's got some downsides. So if everybody can talk, which is not guaranteed on vMix, trust me when I say I'll be able to have complete control of the show. But whether or not we want it, we'll talk about it. Join us on the Discord. Leave comments below if you're interested. I hope you are. Thank you all.
In relation to you years before, where I had made a firm decision that I would never in my life listen to anything this man has to say, based on a 3-minute clip, mind you.
Do you remember what it was that I said that was so profoundly irritating? I mean, there's
do,
many.
Jordan.
Can you tell me what that was?
Of course, you were talking about the gender pay gap, and this was part of a longer interview. The interview that you had with Cathy Newman, and this was a clip, 3-minute clip. You were talking about the gender pay gap, and I didn't even finish the clip. I didn't even finish the 3-minute clip, but based on the things that another out of context clip that I had seen before. And the way that I'd heard your name being spoken of before in the context of the trans conversation that was happening around that time, 2018. And it's almost like I wasn't even listening to what you were saying. I had already decided that I don't like this man because someone that I trust has told me that I shouldn't like him. So therefore, the decision is made. Why do I even have to finish that video?
Right, of course.
And it was just, right? Mm-hmm. And it was just normal.
Well, we use heuristics like that all the time, and
Yes.
It's easy to get caught up in them because, you can't listen to everyone.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to make a snap judgment about almost everyone. And the default is you don't listen because there's like 7 billion people. So obviously you're not listening to most of them. So you don't need much of an excuse. So so you think, you need a simplifying heuristic, and part of that is, that most people aren't worth listening to, and he's definitely not worth listening to. And,
right.
And then that can so easily become politicized. And once it is, it's really, really hard to overcome that. Given the implicit tendency for human beings to have a pronounced in-group preference, and the potential we have for violence against out-group members, how do we all address our proclivity to damn the foreigner? Okay, that's a really important question. And then the next thing is, we all have these proclivities. How are they exacerbated by power and privilege? Right? Those are good questions. But as soon as we make it instantly racist, then we can't even ask the damn questions properly anymore. And are you so sure your life is going so much the way you want it to go, and you're such a bloody paragon of virtue, and the light is shining out every orifice, that everything you think and say is correct, and everyone who disabuses you of your notions is evil? You're really so sure of that, are you? So, you wander around and you think, God, maybe I should listen to this person because I'm such an ignorant bastard and I'm so full of malevolence, and maybe they'll drop one thing on me that won't make me miserable and doomed to hell and to drag everyone else there too. That's, yeah, well.
I felt something similar when I finally leaned into listening to you properly, because what was interesting, even after that moment in 2018, watching that 3-minute clip, deciding this man is evil, I want nothing to do with him. People especially people that were not really connected to the digital world, would always tell me to read your book. It's honestly, people would always say to me, Africa, you will really love this book. I would have friends of mine send me lectures. I think you're really going to like this. And I would just completely ignore it. And in my mind, I'd be thinking, what am I going to find? What am I supposed to like? Because again, I idea of you built up in my head. So I'm finding it very confusing that people that know me very well are telling me that there's something that I'm going to like, right?
Yeah, what the
Very
hell?
confusing. But again, for years, what the hell? For years, I ignored it. So when I started watching your lectures late 2019 and last summer as well, in the beginning, I could notice myself listening to you and waiting for a moment where I could say, aha, see?
Right.
I knew I was right. That again, so it's like there wasn't one moment of being awake and then it's done. So many little, tiny, seemingly insignificant moments where I'm just sitting here by my sofa, just watching and listening, observing myself, waiting, for that confirmation that I'm right. So again, my curiosity, I finally allowed myself to be curious again. And now, Jordan, I can say you have been one of the most influential people to me for so many reasons. To be able to have the conversations that I do now publicly, you have, and I could have never imagined this ever in my entire life. Things like this don't just happen. And the fact that I can tell you this.
Oh no.
Thank you. Just thank you. Thank you.
You got him.
It's a pleasure.
Welcome to In Time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. We read all of your comments, and if you like this video, please don't forget to share.